Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Kelly. I'm with the UC ANR Program Support Unit. I'm here to help with technical issues. You can message anyone that says UC ANR in chat if you need technical assistance at any time. So I'm just going to go over the logistics here real quick before we get started. To participate today, we ask that you type your questions into Zoom's Q&A feature, which is at the bottom. You can see in your Zoom ribbon bar to select Q&A and type your question there. Please add the speaker's name before you add the question. We figure we may not be able to address questions right away after a speaker, so adding their name would be very helpful so we know which speaker you're directing your question to. So if Louise is speaking and you want to ask Louise a question, you would type Louise and then your question. A moderator will read the questions to the speakers to address them. Don't put any questions into the chat. They may get missed. There's a lot of people in the event. Just make sure you type the questions in the Q&A. Chat is for comments and discussion if you want to say hi to someone. If you want everyone to see your chat, make sure you check the drop-down menu and select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it. If it's just all panelists, only the panelists will be able to see. And today for continuing education credits, we have certified crop advisor credits. That is the only thing that we have today. At the very end of the day, we will put up a QR code for you to scan with the app. So if you have time today, please go ahead and download that app. If you do not have an app, that's okay. You can email ANR program support at UC-ANR with your information and we'll get you situated. We'll also drop that email address into the chat at the end of the day to remind you. With that, I'm going to move it over to Louise, who's going to do the welcome.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Oh, wait. And going back up to my start slide. I'd like to welcome you to the 9th Advances in Pistachio Production short course. We've been doing these since the late 80s. This is our 9th course. All the information you're going to see presented will have been based on data from your extension specialist, UC faculty, and your farm advisors. I'd like to start by getting my little laser pointer started here. Just a second. Okay. Just to remind you that we're going to be seeing you for the next 3 weeks, every Monday and Thursday at 8 a.m. for approximately 4 hours. We're hoping to have questions, as Kelly said, at the ends of talks, but we're on a fairly tight schedule for presentation, so if there isn't time at the end of the talk, please stay around, and we hope to have most of the presenters available to speak with you at the end of the session. Also, as Kelly said, type them into Q&A, and if we don't get to them at the end of the session, we can always, the Q&A will be saved and the presenter can answer them directly. Okay. Now, I'd like to introduce you to some new faces you're going to be seeing in this course. We've had a nice set of recent hires at UC. First, there's Dr. Malika Noko. She's going to be the new extension specialist in land, air, and water resources. She comes to us from the University of Wisconsin with degrees in soil science and environment and ag resources. She is replacing Dr. Steve Breton in that department. Tomorrow you will see her present on irrigation systems. We have, and now I know why Bob Beatty can never be replaced. We now have a new partner for him. Dr. Douglas Amaral is the new farm advisor in Kings County. He came on, I believe, September 30th. He's only been on a month. He comes to us from the University of Delaware with a degree in soil and plant science. He has been a postdoc in Dr. Patrick Brown's lab for the last 3 years, so I think some of you already possibly know him. I forgot to mention that Dr. Noko came on last fall. And third, we have Dr. Julia Marino. She's the new extension specialist in orchard systems out of the Department of Plant Sciences, located at the Kearney Agricultural Center. Julia comes to us from the University of Palermo in Palermo, Sicily, Italy, where she did a PhD in fruit tree systems, and she was a postdoctoral scholar with Dr. Daniele Zaccaria for the past 3 years. So I'm sure some of you have also seen her out there working in the salinity experiments. Just want to go over today's presentations briefly. First, we're going to have Dr. Bob Klein from the Administrative Committee for Pistachios and the California Pistachio Research Board. He's going to talk about the state of the pistachio industry, give you some history so you know how far we've come since the 70s, give you some of the economics of the industry, the major problems, and he's also going to be talking about the major organizations, this year's assessment, and other general pistachio industry issues. The second talk will be Dr. Phoebe Gordon, Madera County Farm Advisor. She's going to basically talk to you about what this tree is and how it works, the botany and physiology of the pistachio tree, and why the production practices are what they are. Phoebe may be a little late. If that happens, we're going to move right into the break and give her a couple extra minutes to show up. She had a commitment she couldn't miss. After that, we're going to have Dr. Catherine Jarvis Sheen, Yolo Solano County Farm Advisor, is going to talk to us about the regional considerations in pistachio growing, basically how the different regions climatically and soil and water quality wise are adapted to pistachios and some indications for how you would grow them there. Then we will have another break. At 10:30, Dr. May Columber from Fresno County will talk about site selection, how to evaluate and modify your soils, water, and also talk about salinity management and reclamation. At the end, people will be allowed to stay on and ask questions. And as I said, please type them into the chat and indicate who the question is for so that we can make sure that we address the proper speaker. Finally, I'd like to say that we do have a pistachio production manual produced by all of the people you're going to be hearing over the next 3 weeks. It's a nice, if you don't already have it, here is the address online where you can order it, and be a nice addendum to your short course materials. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Robert Klein, who's going to speak about the state of the California pistachio industry. Bob?
I was given the title of State of the Pistachio Industry, and that's a rather general title, and so I feel I can talk about virtually anything. My name is Bob Klein, as Louise said. I'm the manager for the Administrative Committee for Pistachios and the California Pistachio Research Board. I've been with the industry since 1999. Prior to that, I was a plant pathologist at Washington State University. That's my background. Let's go over a brief history of pistachios in California. Pistachios were not one of the crops brought to California by the Spanish during the mission phase. So we're unlike almonds or walnuts or citrus, olives, grapes, that sort of thing. Pistachios probably did not show up in California until during or after the gold rush. The history is sort of uncertain at that point. But, in 1846, after the Mexican-American War and California and a whole bunch of the Southwest became part of the U.S., they were trying to figure out, USDA was trying to figure out what to do in the arid Southwest, what plants could grow. So they started searching for plants that would grow in the arid Southwest, and they were collecting pistachia from around the world, and they were planting pistachia from as far east as San Antonio, down to Yuma, as far north as Green River, Utah, and out to Oakland. And the people who collected were collecting pistachio, yes, but they weren't collecting necessarily Vera. They were probably collecting Atlantica and Integrima and many of the other different species. And so they were just planted willy-nilly, and nothing really came of that. And that exploration went from about 1880 to 1915. Other people brought in stuff, and so we know there was some commercial production, almost more like hobby growing in California. You know, some of the stuff that was developed at that time was how to grow them, how to process them. The Ruleys had a farm outside of Terabella, but there are others as well. The Peters male that some of you may be familiar with was identified in Fresno as a good male in 1934. So clearly there was enough knowledge to recognize what a good male was in 1934. But the industry really wasn't there. A USDA plant explorer named William Whitehouse was sent to Russia in 1929 to collect alfalfa seed to look for resistance to alfalfa wilt. And somewhat against the wishes of his superiors, he extended his collection for 6 months to collect pistachio in Iran. He collected about 20 pounds of pistachio seed, which he planted at Chico. And then, against the wishes of his superiors, he continued evaluating that material for years afterwards. Out of that collection, there was one promising variety that was identified, and that became the Kerman cultivar that was released in, the germplasm was released in 1957. And commercial plantings of that began in the late 1960s. And the current California pistachio industry, we date to the first harvest in 1976. If you want more information on the statistics regarding the industry, how the acreage is grown and what how the crops have been evaluated, I encourage you to go to our website, the Administrative Committee's website, www.acpistachios.org. But let me say that we've had nearly constant growth of the industry from the late 1960s through 2020. Occasionally, things slow down. When verticillium wilt first appeared on the Atlantica rootstock that was in use back in the late 1970s and into the early 80s, there was a little bit of a slowdown then. When Botrisphaeria appeared in the mid-90s, there was a little bit of a slowdown then. Drought slowed things down, but not as much as you might think. And more recently, pistachio bushy top slowed plantings down for a few years. Regardless, we've gone from about 4,500 bearing acres in 1976, pretty close to 335,000 in 2020. Most of the acreage is located in the southern San Joaquin Valley, from Merced south through Kern County. Although the industry to some extent started further north in the Chico area, the plantings up in that area sort of declined, the rate of expansion sort of declined, probably due to bot and the lack of control. It's a disease that is more common in the wetter areas. And so we didn't have good control for it at the time, so planting sort of declined. The other thing to consider is that almost all the large processors are located in the southern San Joaquin, and so there's a tendency to try to locate near processing plants. The industry has had 3 mandatory pistachio organizations. The first that you'll hear referred to somewhat by older members of the industry like Louise and Bob Beatty and myself, California Pistachio Commission, which was in existence from 1980 to 2007. It was your standard do everything commission. statistics, generic marketing, production research, government relations, etc. It did not survive a reauthorization vote in 2006 and was disbanded in 2007. The Administrative Committee for Pistachios was started in 2004, and it's still in existence. They're technically my employer, and they have been since 2007. Before that, I worked for the Pistachio Commission. The California Pistachio Research Board was started in 2007 and is still currently in existence. I'll talk a bit more about the latter two groups. The Administrative Committee for Pistachios, or ACP, is a federal marketing order that operates on assessments. We do no marketing, despite its name and identification as a marketing order. We do not have authorization for marketing. I am a plant pathologist by training. I'm a technical person. I'm not a marketer, and so we don't do any marketing at all. We were authorized in 2004 by a vote of the growers, and the major emphasis at that point was to regulate aflatoxin in California pistachios, so we could get an import regulation that would mandate testing of all pistachios that were imported into the U.S. Just covering California pistachios wasn't enough to get an import regulation by World Trade Organization rules. So it was expanded to include Arizona and New Mexico in 2010. And we've also authorized an export regulation program. We expanded quality regulations to make sure we were able to address food safety issues. And we do have a clause in there that allows for research. We also collect all the industry statistics. So if you want to know what the shipments have been of pistachios and what the harvest has been, if you go to our website, then we report that on a monthly basis. More recently, we locally administer the Pistachio Export Aflatoxin Reporting Program, or PAIR program. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And I mentioned earlier, I'm an employee of the ACP. The ACP manages the California Pistachio Research Board, and I am tasked about 50% time for ACP and about 50% time for the Research Board. So the Research Board is a California state marketing order, again doing no marketing, and we operate on assessments, and those assessments are paid by growers. The previous assessments are paid by handlers. I should mention about the ACP. The ACP assessments are very small, basically 1/100 of a cent per pound. The CPRB initiated in 2007 following the demise of the California Pistachio Commission, because we did not have a way to address the research needs of the industry. So the CPRB is authorized to conduct production research and grower education. It consists of 9 members plus 4 alternates and a public member. They're elected for 3-year terms, no term limits, and they're elected at large. So there's no districts or anything like that. Since we've started the Research Board, the assessments have ranged from 1/4 of a cent to 0.8 of a cent per dry pound. The higher rates were used to support the sterile insect technology program. We now have more federal money coming in, so our cash involvement in that is declining. So our current assessment is 0.3 of a cent per dry pound. I caution to say that the assessed, we talk about assessed weight, and assessed weight, or some people refer to it as CPC weight, is slightly different than the paid weight you would see on what you get from your handler, from your processor. When you look at paid weight, you're paid for the edible kernel weight out of your closed shell and shelling stock. But for assessment purposes, we add the shell back onto that edible kernel weight. So it's basically a 1-to-1. So if you want, for every pound of edible kernel weight, you have a pound of shell. So it basically doubles the weight. So what is the outlook that we see for the industry right now? Our acreage, we're over 400,000 acres, counting non-bearing. We're going to be getting a new acreage survey that's coming in this month. So we'll have more precise numbers later this month. The rate of planting does not appear to be slowing. You know, we're probably adding 20 to 30,000 new acres every year. Our current crop, the 2020 crop, we expect to be over 1 billion pounds, slightly over. All the indications are we don't have the final numbers yet. It's probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.05 to 1.1 billion pounds. The current planted acreage and the age range suggests that we're likely to have a crop of 1.6 billion pounds by 2026. And an off-year crop in 2023 is probably going to be very close to 1 billion pounds. In the past, our record crop this year, 1 billion pounds, will be equaled by the off-year crop, not next year, but the 2 years after that. So that's 2023. So it'll probably be close to 1 billion pounds in 2023. Now, all my predictions, I'm going to use weasel words and say, oh, I could be wrong, because almost all the new acreage going in is lost in Golden Hills, and that has a slightly higher bearing potential than Kerman. So production could be higher. It could also be lower if the chill effects or low chill effects are seen on Kerman. And production could be lower if there are water and nutrient regulations that affect the production. For our crop, about 70% of our pistachios are exported, and global supply is very important when you look at the world market. The major producers are the US, Iran, and Turkey. And so it's really based on how many pounds are available worldwide, given how much it is a global crop. As we have seen US production increase, Iranian production has also been declining. So probably the global supply has stayed very constant. But in any case, it has increased at a far lower rate than just our production. Iranian production is declining because they have severe water problems and water quality problems, and they're pushing their production into areas that have more water, but it appear to be a less conducive environment. So what are our concerns? I'm going to break our concerns for the near future into production, regulatory, infrastructure, and market. In the production concerns, we include diseases, pests, climate, and horticultural consideration. Predominant among our pests is navel orangeworm. It is our single largest consumer complaint. No one likes to open a pistachio shell, in-shell pistachio, pop it in their mouth, and find that it consists mostly of navel orangeworm and frass. And we get a lot of complaints about that. The other problem with navel orangeworm that is linked to mycotoxins, and I'll come back to that a bit later. We have mealybug, and it is spreading across the industry. It's going to continue to spread. I don't see that we're going to successfully quarantine it in the current acres wherever eradicate it. So be sure to pay attention to what you need to look at for control. Big bugs, primarily the stink bugs and leaf-footed bug, cause kernel necrosis as well as abortions. The kernel necrosis seems to be more severe in the Lost Hills and Golden Hills. So as we're looking at that, we'll have to consider that more often, as we go into the future. We also worry about invasive pests. Brown marmorated stink bug is one that's catching a lot of news right now. Years ago, it was carob moth. We had glassy wing sharpshooter, various things like that. Brown marmorated stink bug is appearing in almond orchards. We haven't seen much of an issue yet in pistachios, but we're continuing to look at that. Climate, of course, is a concern. we're living in a warming climate. How much it's warming, we don't know. What the endpoint's going to be. What we're seeing is warming also can be confused with variability in the climate. Obviously, in historic times, things varied quite a bit with, we had hot spells back in the 1930s. We had cool spells at other times. We recently came out of a drought, but historically there are long-term droughts. The most recent long-term drought, and I mean long-term, ended in the early 1700s, and that was a 140-year drought that in which the average precipitation was 60% of what we considered normal. So you can be pretty sure that during those 140 years, you had years where precipitation was normal, and then you had years when it was maybe 10% of normal. So drought is always a concern. We look at the horticultural concerns. We're going to need varieties and rootstocks to match the climate, the pests, and the diseases. We've gone from Kerman to Lost Hills and Golden Hills. We've gone from Atlantica rootstock to Pistachio and Tegarima, and now we're almost all on a hybrid UCB1 type rootstocks. And most of this has been to address the root-borne diseases and climate. We have regulatory concerns. A substantial amount of our CPRB budget goes to address regulatory issues. We have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, and that will limit the amount of nutrients that can leach to groundwater to make sure you're not contaminating the aquifers. The nitrogen is the biggest concern. As we go forward, you're going to hear a little bit about A-R or A-R. That is the amount of applied nutrients relative to the amount of nutrients that is removed when you harvest the crop. So how much, how the regulations develop will rotate around that. It's the Irrigated Lands Program, and that might limit the amount of water that can be removed from groundwater. And that will reduce your flexibility to irrigate when surface supplies are low. And then we have the CV salts issue, which is somewhat related to the SGMA, and will be the leaching issues. How much salt can you leach down into the groundwater, where the other one focuses more on nitrogen. The phase in of all these programs has been and will be slow, but the regulations that are put in place over the next few years are going to affect how you grow. Ultimately, the regulators are going to want to merge all the programs together into one cohesive regulatory program. You need to make sure that as a grower, you are part of your local group. The name escapes me now. The different different regional water quality boards that represent growers and not a state. They're not beholden to the state. They're representing growers, and the growers opt into it because they will help you meet the regulations. Regardless, there's going to be a lot of paperwork. All these government concerns thrive on paperwork. So you want to be aware that there's going to be some administrative cost to this. When I look at infrastructure from the CPRB side, I'm more concerned about the research. We conduct our research through UC, through UC ANR, USDA, and California State University. Almost all the talks that you listen to over the next few weeks will be based on research that has been conducted by one of those groups. The so we have a tremendous research database, and we need to continue to develop that. As time has gone on, there seems to be less of a commitment to agricultural research at both the state level and the federal level. And so we've always been short on research personnel to work on pistachios. So we've created endowments to ensure that some positions will continue. We have an endowment for soil water research. We have an endowment for genetics. We partnered with ANR to create the plant pathology, the extension plant pathology position at Kearney. And we worked with the Almond Board and ANR for other positions as well. We get very concerned about how many farm advisors we have, and will we be able to retain them. You know, you can talk to any of the farm advisors about what the staffing levels used to be on the county level and what they are now. And so the farm advisors are being spread very thin. So we're glad to have the new ones that Louise mentioned. We want to make sure we're able to retain them. And so we make sure we're trying to assist them in every way we can to make them as efficient as possible. The other side of infrastructure, of course, is the production side of it, which would be land, labor, and processing. Always a concern is adequate land with reliable water. Pistachios have an advantage over almonds in that we're far more amenable to different types of soil and far more salt tolerant than virtually any other crop in California. But nevertheless, you can see with the irrigated with all the regulatory programs, the question for reliable water is always there. We expect there to be more and more automation. I'm not sure how much more automation we're going to be able to do in the field. You know, of course, there's going to be self-driving tractors, and there's probably going to be more scouting with drones and things like that. But labor is always a concern, both at the farm level and at the processing level, because a lot of the processing is hand labor, especially the final sort out step in developing products. And that becomes a labor bottleneck in some years of production. We should also remember that we use a lot of natural gas to dry pistachios at the processing plant. And natural gas is not it's not blessed well by the regulators that we have who are concerned about climate change. Of course, I qualified things earlier by saying I'm not a marketer, but at the same time, everybody's going to expect me to say something about market. And so I'll look at it more from a technical side. And of course, we're going to have bigger crops, and we're going to need more and larger markets. And market access can be expanded by or restricted by crop quality. We expanded into the European market because of our superior quality compared to other countries. Our growth in the European market can also be restricted by crop quality, and this goes for other markets as well. Quality, of course, is an ambiguous term, but for the most part, we'll say it includes pesticides, which are under constant pressure, and mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are an especially significant concern for European exports. They include both aflatoxin, which many of you have probably heard of, and ochratoxin A, which many of you probably haven't heard of, but is becoming more and more of an issue. So aflatoxin is a carcinogenic byproduct of Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus. It is highly regulated. We have a domestic tolerance in pistachios of 15 ppb, which is lower than the tolerance on other products in the US. That's our creation of 15 ppb, the industry creation of 15 ppb. The US tolerance is 20. The EU has a tolerance of 8 ppb, that's parts per billion, for B1, which is one of the types of aflatoxin, and 10 ppb for all aflatoxins. When you talk about ppb, remember pesticides are regulated in the parts per million, the ppms. Here we're talking about parts per billion. The codex tolerance for aflatoxin is 10 ppb. The amount of contamination we have in a given year is a function of how much navel orangeworm damage we have and how much fungal infection occurs in those damaged nuts. For the last 3 years, we have had very low navel orangeworm damage, and consequently, we had low aflatoxin. So our navel orangeworm damage has been in the range of 0.2%, and our aflatoxin has been so low that it's hardly been a concern. But prior to that, we had high navel orangeworm damage running up, average damage running up in the 2% range, and we had very high aflatoxin. And that high aflatoxin meant that the EU got very concerned about what we had, and they put in a whole bunch of testing restrictions on US pistachios. And we had to put the PAIR program in place. The PAIR program is on the exporter side, the processor side, and they have to report. We have regulated sampling according to the EU protocol for all export lots. The growers, the processors have to report on each of those, on each lot, on the aflatoxin levels. They have to be tested in a USDA certified lab. And the program is audited by a different branch of the USDA. So all this comes with cost. And consequently, when you see as a grower that they're putting in premiums for low navel orangeworm damage, it's partly to address consumer issues with navel orangeworm damage and partly to address the aflatoxin issues. And so when you look at the range then on the penalties and the premiums for navel orangeworm, that gives you some idea of what the magnitude is of the problem. Finally, OTA, it's a byproduct of other Aspergillus species, and it only recently showed up on the EU pistachio radar. It has uncertain toxicity. The other one was aflatoxin is a carcinogen, so this one has uncertain toxicity. But nevertheless, the EU is proposing a 5 part per billion tolerance. That compares to basically a 10 part per billion for aflatoxin. We know virtually nothing about OTA contamination in pistachios. We assume that it's very similar to aflatoxin. The Netherlands has been testing for ochratoxin, and the results are similar then to aflatoxin.
Bob, you've got about 4 more minutes.
Yep. So the aflatoxin and OTA combined could be a very major problem. Even with the programs we have in place for aflatoxin, we still get we can get up to 5% rejections of lots into the EU. The OTA would be an additive thing, and that would give us 10% rejections. The EU does not want to see more than 5%. So the problems that we could have could become quite severe. So those are my concerns as we go forward in the industry goes forward. And I'm open to any questions. I'm always available on my email at bobk@acpistachios.org.
So
I'd be happy to answer any of your questions with the time remaining or at the end of the presentations.
So Bob, you've got about 2 minutes here, but I don't see any questions written into chat. Does anybody have any questions?
Louise, sorry, they're not in chat, they're in Q&A.
Oh, excuse me, I'm looking at Q&A. I'm looking at Q&A.
There are a few questions in there.
Oh, okay. Most
Yeah.
of the questions I see are related to the links.
If you go to the open tab and not the answered tab, go to the open.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bob, what are the key reasons the acreage is increasing at such a rapid pace?
Well, of course, pistachios have been very profitable. You do have the long non-bearing period to get them up to bearing, but after that, they're by all accounts, they're probably the most profitable crop that we currently have in California, at least a significant crop. The market has been good. Prices have not declined even with the greater production. You have acreages that are going out of cotton production, given the tolerance of pistachios to that type of soil and low water quality. There's not many other crops you can put in some of the locations where other crops are going out. So there's a lack of other options, and combined with the profitability of pistachios.
Okay, so basically some of these questions now next are asking things that are going to be answered in the coming talks, like comparing rootstocks. But let's go down to one that applies to everybody. With the government limit on digging wells, when and what depth if no surface water is nearby? Do you have an answer to that, or would you prefer to put that to the irrigation people?
I think that's going to have to go to the irrigation people. It depends a lot, and it depends a lot on what drainage basin you're in. So, you know, there's some areas that have I guess, recently gotten declared that because they have non-palatable water underneath them, they don't have quite the concern. So there's be some variances, but I can't really answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question here that really applies to everybody. Luke Millerone, Farm Advisor, Northern California, asked, where can we get the old research reports?
The old research reports are all on the CPRB website, calpistachioresearch.org. We have the, in the database there are all the full reports. Only recently have we been publishing the executive summaries. Those were almost always published in the past in the conference booklets, but now we're publishing those separately. But all the full reports are available online at calpistachioresearch.org.
Okay.
It's a searchable database, no password necessary to get in.
Okay. So with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to go to our next speaker. Your questions in Q&A will be referred to the people who could probably best answer them better than Bob in some cases. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Phoebe Gordon, the farm advisor in Madera County, who is going to speak to you about the botany and physiology of the pistachio tree. Phoebe?
Hi, before I start, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. All right, let's see. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to be covering the, like Louise said, botany and physiology of the pistachio tree. So there aren't going to be a lot of management implications in this talk. This talk is mostly to help you understand the pistachio tree itself, since a lot of our management practices are based on the performance of the tree and how it behaves. So the entire goal of agriculture, and something to keep in mind when you're managing any orchard or other crop, is that you are turning sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into carbohydrates. And so this is done in the above ground portions of the plant, the green portions with chlorophyll. And this process is called photosynthesis. And so and as a byproduct, you get oxygen. The opposite process where you turn carbohydrates into carbon dioxide and water is called respiration. This is still a critically important process in plants since the only parts that do photosynthesis are the green portions. And so that's also only happening when there's sunlight. There is nighttime when plants still need to generate energy, and critically, the below ground portions of the plant do not photosynthesize. And because the energy compounds that directly come out of photosynthesis are very short term, they're very high energy, but they're also unstable. And so plants make carbohydrates to move to other portions of the plant or to put into their seeds. And we just have the byproduct of eating them. And so it's what we do in agriculture is we try to make this process as efficient as possible. And so any sort of stress will either reduce photosynthetic efficiency, or it's going to require plants to turn some of these sugars into compounds that enable them to deal with stress better. All right, so the pistachio tree is part of the order Sapindales. And so specifically the family is Anacardiaceae. And so it shares this family with, well, it's related to mangoes and cashews, and it's also related to the poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac. But there are some plants that are edible that we eat. The genus itself is Pistachia, and this isn't a fairly large genus. The one that we rely on commercially is Pistachia vera because it's the only pistachia species that has seeds that are large enough to bother trying to grow. It's not the only commercially important pistachia species, though. We also rely on, or in the past, we relied a lot on Pistachia atlantica. And the hybrid between Pistachia atlantica and Pistachia integrima is one of the more important, well, the most important rootstocks that we have currently in the industry. And so rootstocks will be covered in a later talk. I won't be talking about them anymore. Because I also, my background is actually in landscape horticulture, I do have to mention that Pistachia chinensis, or the Chinese pistache, is a very important street tree out here, and it's just starting to show fall color, and it's one of the few street trees that we have in California that shows fall color, so it's one of my favorites. I just like to mention that. So the pistachio tree is a temperate deciduous tree, which just means that it loses its leaves during the fall, like most of the trees most of the trees that we grow in the Central Valley. The pistachia species are native to areas between 40 to 70 degrees latitude, which is just the temperate region in the world. Pistachia vera itself is from Western Asia and Asia Minor. You can still find wild pistachia vera trees growing there. It's been in California for a long time, but it's really only become commercially important until later on in the 20th century. It's a very small tree. It's only about 25 to 35 feet in height. It's what's called apically dominant, which is where the shoot tips will exude a hormone that prevents branching happening until it gets farther down in the branch. And so a lot of the pruning practices that we have are to specifically try to encourage branching. It has a period of long juvenility, much longer than the other nut crops that we grow. Although research that's being led by Bruce Lampinen and May Columber is showing that this might be, well, it's probably also due in part to the very heavy pruning that we do to these young trees. But in general, that is a concern for some folks when I talk to them about planting pistachio orchards, is they don't want to wait that long to start getting nuts. So the crop itself is born on 1-year-old wood, and it's alternate bearing. Although, as I'm going to go over later in the talk, we still don't understand a lot about alternate bearing, and later cultivars and rootstocks are reducing the degree at which these trees may be alternate bearing. So this is a pistachio branch, and so we have the 1-year-old wood. Let me get my little pointer out. We have the 1-year wood back here with the crop. Current season's wood has all of the leaves and buds for next year. And then we have an apical bud right here. So this apical bud contains all the primordia for next year's growth, since that includes the leaves, as well as the cells that are going to become reproductive buds. that will continue to mature, and then the following year they will flower and set fruit. This is just a photo showing the apical dominance of pistachio. So you can see this is a young orchard, and it just has these whip-like growths. So the pistachio tree is what's called dioecious, which is a botanical term. The technical definition means separate houses, but what it really means is that male flowers and female flowers are born on separate plants, unless you graft to get them on the same plant. And so what this means is that when you're selecting pollinators for whatever cultivar or your variety that you're growing, you need to make sure that you're picking a male that has good bloom overlap with the female. And so this will be covered in a later talk. And so this is just a photo showing how important bloom overlap is. So we have Golden Hills right here. And on the right, we have Peters, which is the male, which is just, or a male, which is just starting to, the flowers are just starting to emerge, and Randy, which is at full bloom. And so there are differences, and so it's important to select the correct pollinator. So on the left, we have a close-up of a male pistachio flower releasing its pollen. And on the right, we have a female flower. And so pistachio flowers are, they're both imperfect and incomplete. And so I always get the terms mixed up, but one of them is, there are flowers that have both male and female parts, and those are perfect. Imperfect flowers have either male or female. And complete flowers have, the sepals, the petals, and the reproductive organs, whereas incomplete flowers do not have petals. And so because pistachios are wind pollinated, producing petals and things that attract bees is just a waste of energy. And so these flowers do not have it. That's not to say that you will sometimes see bees in pistachio orchards collecting pollen from the males, but they are not actually doing any pollination. It all happens through the wind. And so there's some work done by Craig Carlson that shows that bloom temperatures are very important, and that warm temperatures will reduce or have been correlated with lower yields. And so you need to have, in the springtime, you need to have cool, but not too cold temperatures, and not too much, well, ideally no rain, because that leads to disease issues as well as issues with pollination. So pistachio flowers are born on clusters called panicles, and they have 100 to 200 flowers per panicle. A very small percentage of them end up setting and making it all the way through harvest. So there's usually an average of 14 per panicle, and anywhere from 5 to 30% of those fruit can be blanks. The flowers are also apically dominant, and so most nuts are going to set at the tip of these panicles. The fruit is a drupe, which is a botanical term that doesn't really have much genetic meaning. I think that these terms were made up before people really understood genetics and true relationships with plants. And so like a palm fruit is also a drupe. And if you know anything about plants, you'll know that pistachios and palms are not very closely related at all, aside from the fact that they're both flowering plants. Pistachios are capable of parthenocarpy, which is can lead to a couple of different causes of blanking, which I will go over towards the end of the talk. So pistachios are fairly unusual compared to a lot of the other crops that we grow here in the pattern of fruit growth. And so you have this, so stage one is the period of basically the hull and the shell expansion, and that completes fairly early on in fruit development. And then stage two is the stage of shell hardening, and that will actually continue along through stage three, which is when the kernel will start to grow. So I have some photos showing fruit development. And so this is taken right after the pericarp, which is the shell, and the hull has fully expanded, and we have the embryo here. It'll start to grow throughout the summer as shell hardening continues until it is ready for harvest. And here we have a nice photo of a freshly harvested pistachio fruit. So pistachios are pretty, they need cool temperatures during wintertime. They also need a lot of heat during the summertime. And so we have some data on how much heat is needed. And so there isn't much difference between the different cultivars and how long it takes for them to fully expand their hull and shell. It's all about the same. There are some pretty stark differences in how long it takes for shell hardening to finish, however. So Kerman takes about 2,500 growing degree days, and Lost Hills requires over 3,000. And so if you look at when the kernel is finished developing, you'll see that Lost Hills, that kernel will be developed about 1,000 degree days before that shell is finished hardening. So there are differences between the cultivars and how much heat requirement they need. So pistachios also like cool winters, but they don't like really cold winters. And so they don't like hard freezes, particularly before the trees are fully dormant. And so a hard freeze is any temperature that's less than 28 degrees Fahrenheit, although they can withstand colder temperatures when they're fully dormant. So they have and I'm not going to go over this in too much. I believe the next speaker for the next talk is going to go over this in much more in depth. But so we have a method for trying to describe how long it takes for a certain plant to go through a dormancy period based on how many hours or how long of a period of cold that they get. And so that period that is called dormancy. And so dormancy is when growth does not occur in living plants. And so there are two types of dormancy. One is endodormancy, which is where growth doesn't occur due to conditions within the plant. And so this can be, the chill period. And so if you take a plant that's going through endodormancy and you put them in ideal conditions where it's these long, beautiful 70-degree days, they won't grow or they won't grow normally, depending on how far they are in their dormancy period. And so this is an issue of concern in California, and it's becoming more of a concern. And that's definitely going to be gone over in the next talk. Ecodormancy is when growth does not occur due to conditions external to the plant. And so this is something I typically think of that happens a little bit more in the Midwest, where you get these cold winters. And so the plant's dormancy requirements may be met, but because it's still really cold outside, it's too cold for growth, they stay dormant. But as soon as those spring temperatures come, they come out of dormancy. So I'm just going to mention this briefly to let you know that there are different ways of calculating the dormancy period. The traditional way is the chilling hour requirement, which is just dependent on temperature. And so you just count the number of hours within a certain range. And so that works well when in areas where it gets cold and it stays cold, but it doesn't do that in California. And in the past, it worked okay, but we think that it might be because we used to get a lot more tule fog in the past, and we do not get as much now. And so that fog will refract sunlight and keep the plants cool. The better model is the dynamic model. It seems to work a little bit better here. And so that takes into account these warm periods when you're trying to calculate chill. And so Catherine Drivashian has looked at chill portion requirements for Kerman and Peters, and so we do have some numbers there. So I'm going to be mentioning, I already kind of mentioned this already with Craig Collison, but he did this a really great project modeling, taking a bunch of temperature and other factors into yield. And so I already mentioned one finding that warm temperatures during bloom are correlated with lower yields. So what he did is, well, he also took previous year's yield into account because pistachios are alternate bearing. And so he found that last year's yield is the strongest predictor of current year's yield. So if last year was an on year, you're more likely to most likely to have an off year this year. And if last year is an off year, you're probably going to have an on year. But he also found that warm temperatures during the dormancy period, so over 65 degrees Fahrenheit, are negatively correlated with current season's yield. And so I do want to say models shouldn't be taken literally. This was more just to try to figure out if there are other things that we should be taking into account. And so what he's suggesting is that maybe we need to stop thinking about, are we getting enough chill? Although he did find chill was important, but we also need to be thinking about heat as well during the winter time. And so I'm sharing this because there's more involved with yields than just chill. So we don't really know what temperatures pistachios, low temperatures pistachios can't stand. So we do know that due to a very bad freeze in 1990, there was a trial, or we know that there's a trial with different rootstocks. And so those with Integrima, that were pure Integrima, had fairly high mortality. But those with Pistachio atlantica or some Pistachio atlantica genes did not suffer any mortality. And so it seems that Pistachio atlantica does confer, or has better cold tolerance and confers it to its offspring. So there is, you can get damage with cooler temperatures, not necessarily freezing temperatures. It used to be called frost or cold damage. I think that the term that's been coined for it now is winter juvenile tree dieback. Craig Kelson has written this really nice paper on it, if you're really curious about it, where he goes into it far more in depth than I can in this talk. But basically, we don't have a lot of research. Mostly it's just based on observational data. And so we know that it's associated with, it's exhibited by trees that suffer damage during the winter time and either die back or completely die. And so rootstocks that do have Integrima parentage seem to be more sensitive to it. It's associated with higher vigor in the fall, but not always associated with frost events. And it can be associated with wet soils or sodium affected soils, since sodium affected soils tend to have poor water movement because soils are dispersed. So I have a photo here of a rootstock that's been killed by frost. And so the bark has been cut away. And so you can see what's called here the vascular cambium, which is this row of cells that gives rise to the xylem and the phloem. It's dark brown because it's been killed. And so here's another photo of an orchard that's on a seedling rootstock. And so not everything was killed because there is some genetic variation in this UCB1 seedling. And so this is basically what it looks like. And so there's some research that was done by Orr Sperling and Maciej Zwinecki looking at water stress in plants. And so they found they exhibited or induced water stress in UCB1 rootstocks. And so they found that UCB1 rootstocks that suffered mild stress, and then they subjected them to freezing stress. It took lower temperatures to get them to freeze. And then when they thawed them, they had exhibited less damage than plants that were fully watered. And so it's thought that the mechanisms that plants use to deal with water stress might be similar to what they use to deal with cold stress. And so that just kind of goes more into the high vigor going into fall. Okay, so pistachios are a very drought tolerant plant. They're what's called phreatophytes, which means that they can exploit deep reservoirs of water. They're also very adapted to arid conditions. And so they have a cuticle that's very thick. And so the cuticle is this waxy covering on the leaf that is involved with keeping water in the plants. So they have, in leaves, there's this tissue called the mesophyll. And so that's responsible for the bulk of photosynthesis in a leaf. And so they have a specific type of mesophyll that's adapted to hot and dry conditions. There's more stomata on the side of the leaf that faces away from the sun than towards the sun. Stomatal conductance, so gas exchange, is also higher on that side. And the stomata are located near leaf veins. They can be affected by drought though. And so we can see that by breaking down the different components of yield. So components of yield are basically what specific things are required to get a high yield. And so in pistachios, that's the number of clusters that you can find on a tree, the number of nuts per cluster, the weight of the nuts, and the quality of the nuts. So drought stress will affect current season's yield as well as next year's yield. So it'll affect current year's yield by affecting the number of nuts per cluster, nut weight, and nut quality. And so it can either do that through blanking, kernel abortion, or poor nut removal at harvest. Nut weight can be directly influenced by low water by decreasing photosynthesis, and so you're not putting as much sugars into that fruit. And nut quality can be affected by having more early splits or more no splits. And so future yield is affected by decreased clusters. So that's either carbohydrate storage in stems and trunks and increased bud abscission, or in really extreme cases, it could just be reducing the growth of the plant itself. Pistachios also do not tolerate wet feet. In general, when plants are dormant, they tolerate flooded soils better. But roots, like I mentioned earlier, they cannot photosynthesize, and so they need to respire. So they need oxygen just like us. Oxygen movement through saturated soils is much, much slower than non-saturated soils. And so roots can eventually starve and die. So one of the reasons why we like growing pistachios, aside from the fact that they are a tasty nut, is that they are very salt tolerant. One of the most salt tolerant tree species we grow here in California. So I have this graph that shows the decline in yield potential as salinity increases in the root zone. And so we can see here that pistachios are beat only by date palms. And the wimpy prunus species are not very salt tolerant at all. So salt tolerance will affect plants in two different ways. It can affect it through what's called specific ion damage, which is where harmful ions are taken up by the plant and they cause damage to plant tissues and they eventually kill them. So when you think of leaf tip dieback, that's due to specific ion damage. They can also affect plants through what's called osmotic effects. And so how that happens is that you have basically, salts in the soil like to gather water molecules around them. And so if you have a lot of salts, there's not as much water that's available for uptake. And so plants either have to compete and work harder to take up water, or they just can't. So a greenhouse study, or Louise Ferguson has done a lot of salinity work in pistachios. And so we know through her work that the osmotic effects are greater than the specific ion effects in pistachio. And so it seems like the Pistachio atlantica, just like how it confers a little bit more frost tolerance, also seems to confer a little bit more drought tolerance or salt tolerance. We also know that established trees can be irrigated with water up to 8 decisiemens per meter without affecting yield. And that was work done by Blake Sandin, and later work done by Blake Sandin also shows that the salt tolerance of establishing orchards is probably lower. And so another thing that I did not include here, but due to work done by Louise Ferguson, it seems like when you see leaf tip burn on pistachios, the data that we have shows that it's due to high boron rather than high sodium and chloride. So I'm going to go a little bit over the patterns of uptake of pistachios, but I'm not going to go over fertilization. So in general, pistachios take up nutrients at a rate reflecting demand. This is no different from the other tree crops that we grow here in the valley. There's no uptake during dormancy. In general, a nice rule of thumb is that when the trees are photosynthesizing, that's when they can take up nutrients. There's very little uptake between harvest and leaf senescence. The fruit does show a very strong demand for nutrients, and so there is very high uptake during nut fill, particularly on years. And for potassium in general, 90% of the potassium that's taken up by the tree in a given year is during this nut fill period. There's higher uptake in on years than off, but where those nutrients end up does differ. And so in on years, most of the nutrients end up in the fruit. In off years, they end up in, or a lot of it ends up in perennial tissues. Okay, so I have this little diagram to help understand how the pattern of nutrient uptake occurs in pistachios. So in on year, they have a high amount of stored nutrients. Uptake is low during the initial flowering and fruit growth stage because they have what they need. Once those reserves become depleted, the uptake is very high during the embryo growth period. Harvest removes a large amount of nutrients from the tree. In an off year, stored nutrients are low because the trees have been depleted. There is relatively higher uptake during the flowering and early fruit growth. But because the demand tends to not be as higher in an off year, the uptake is moderate during the embryo growth period. Harvest removes a lower amount of nutrients. More is reserved in the perennial tissues in the plant, and they start off an on year with high amounts of stored nutrients. And so looking at this, it can be tempting to think that nutrients are the driver of alternate bearing. However, the current understanding that we currently have is that it's probably due to carbohydrates. Okay, so there are some physiological issues that will affect pistachios. And so one is alternate bearing. Another issue is non-splits, and the last is blank nuts. So alternate bearing is dependent on variety and rootstock. And so previously, when we were on the Atlantica rootstock, it seemed the alternate bearing was pretty extreme. Although it seems like with some of our newer cultivars and maybe our more vigorous rootstocks seem to have reduced alternate bearing. And so I have this I here that's called the alternate bearing index. And so an I, it just describes the degree of alternate bearing. So an I of 1 means that a tree is completely alternate bearing. And so it bears all of its fruit in 1 year, nothing in another year. An I of 0 means it bears basically the same thing every single year. And so I wouldn't say that these numbers are set in stone because different research can show different things. But this just is a nice indicator that there do seem to be differences between the varieties. As to why more vigorous rootstocks have reduced alternate bearing, it could be because they're more vigorous and they have more leaf area. It could be that they're better at scavenging nutrients. I don't think that we really know that. It's important to understand, though, that in an orchard, even though an orchard might be on or off, you'll find trees in an orchard that are not in sync with the rest of the orchard. And you can find on a tree, you'll find branches that are also not in sync with the tree. And so there was a study done by Rosenstock where they followed trees in a pistachio orchard for 6 years. And so even though this is only one orchard, they found that 58% of the trees followed an alternate bearing pattern, and the rest of them just had a random bearing pattern. And so it's, I'm telling you this because it's really complicated and it's still not fully understood, but we do have some idea. It's not like we're completely in the dark, but the science is there's still active research going on in this area to try to figure out what's going on in pistachios. So this is just a photo of a rootstock trial showing the differences in vigor. So in the far side of the picture, we have Atlantica. And so you can see that our more modern rootstocks are much more vigorous than Pistachio Atlantica. So there's been some circumstantial work showing that carbohydrates seem to be the best explanation for alternate bearing. And so one research project looked at girdling a branch between the leaves, which are providing a lot of the carbohydrates and the fruit. And so they found that girdling between the leaves and the fruit reduced bud abscission. There's also been some work done that has shown that bud drop and embryo development are correlated with each other, and that the more fruit you have on a branch, the more severe bud abscission that you have. And so, like I said, research is actively ongoing, but right now it just seems like carbohydrates are the best explanation that we have. This is a on branch on an off tree, just to show you how strong the demand is that the fruit put on the tree. And so this, the 1-year-old wood is, and the tree is providing nutrients and carbohydrates. They're taking up what they can, but the fruit will also deplete nutrients and carbohydrates from nearby wood as well, because the tree just can't, if it's a really heavy bearing year, they just can't supply enough. And so these trees are exhibiting nitrogen deficiency, probably maybe some potassium deficiency as well. So currently the best method that has been developed for dealing with alternate bearing is altering the ratio of on and off branches on a tree. And so that can either be done by topping or by hedging. So work led by Louise Ferguson looked at a hedging and topping trial. And so you can see here that while the cumulative yields between hedged and top trees and controlled trees was the same, you can see that the alternate bearing swings in the control trees are much greater than in the hedging and top trees. So you don't bear as much in on years, but you make it up by bearing more in off years. Okay, so let's see, non-splits are also an issue. So that can be due to water stress during the kernel fill period. Early splits can be due to water stress during the hull expansion period. And early splits are an issue because they can host navel orangeworm and are correlated with more aflatoxin, I believe. Blanking is an issue in the industry, and this has a couple of different causes. So blanking can be either due to carbohydrate or water stress, really extreme. Another thing that can happen is, so when pollination happens, you have a pollen grain land on the female flower, and a pollen tube grows and reaches the egg cell. And so if for any reason that pollination doesn't occur, so either the pollen tube doesn't complete its growth, or maybe for some reason the pollen dies before that happens, you can get the hull and the shell growing. It seems to stimulate that growth without actual fertilization of the embryo growing. Some work led by Lu Zhang also has showed that dusty conditions may contribute to blanking. And so I do want to say that this was an artificial pollination trial, although the results are pretty dramatic. And so basically what they did is they collected pistachio pollen and they mixed it with varying degrees of dust. And they also tried out herbicide contaminated dust as well. And then they brushed it onto female flowers. And so they found that as the amount of dust increases in a pollen mix, the percent fruit set decreases, as well as the blanking increases as well. So we have the control up here. As you can see, as you go from pure pollen to a bunch of dust, the blank percentage increases. And herbicide contaminated dust just killed the female flower. So they initiated this work by observing really dusty conditions in a drought year due to just regular harvest operations. And so in general, try to do anything that's going to kick up a lot of dust during pollination, but this could be another cause of blanking that we see in the field. So the only thing that is, I guess, left to do is actually go out on a dusty day or induce dusty conditions in the field and see if that actually increases blanking. But I finished with some time to spare for some questions. And so in general, if you want to reach me due to the pandemic, if you're in Madera and Merced counties, email is always, well, in general, email is the best way to reach me. I do have a podcast with Luke Milliron called Growing the Valley Podcast, where we cover a lot of, we cover basically all tree crops that grow in the Central Valley. And we do have some, one-off episodes as well as more in-depth series. And then we have the San Joaquin Valley Trees and Vines. So that's where you can find a lot of articles that San Joaquin Valley advisors have written, as well as back when we were allowed to have in-person meetings, we would put those on the website as well. So I'm happy to take any questions.
So Phoebe, you've got some questions in chat, so I'll read some of them to you.
Okay.
First, I've seen in the literature a process that occurs in the root system of trees referred to as translocation, where water and nutrients can be moved from different zones within the root system. Is there any evidence of this in pistachios?
I don't know. I would ask our root person, Astrid Folder, that. I mean, we do, in general, yeah, water and nutrients moves up, but I don't know if it can be transferred from one part of the root system to the other.
Okay. Here's another one. I've seen data no, excuse me. If I understand correctly, you stated that less water in a tree combined with freezing temperatures will help the tree survive versus a tree that is fully irrigated.
I would say that I think that it could help. And I think that, let's see, Craig Carlson is one who's done a lot of work with that. So the study, it was done with artificially inducing water stress and monitoring it with stem water potential. So it was a very controlled thing. But in general, recommendations for dealing or trying to reduce the chance of winter juvenile tree dieback are to do things that are going to reduce vigor in juvenile trees. So those are trees that are not really young, but also haven't started to fully bear. It's just, you have to keep in mind that if your trees are starting to bear nuts, inducing water stress during critical times will affect what's happening to the crop. And so I was more sharing that because, well, anything to reduce vigor going into dormancy, we think it's going to help, but like I said, most of what we know about winter juvenile tree dieback is based on observational data, not experimental inducing things to try to get winter juvenile tree dieback to happen. So it's what we know is based off of observation.
Okay, here's another question. I've seen data that suggests nitrogen uptake occurs at night. It just jumped away from me. While potassium uptake occurs during daylight hours. Do you have any evidence to support this?
I have not seen anything to support or deny that. That's the first I've heard of it, but I haven't looked into daily patterns of nutrient uptake either. So
here's another one. When do trees hit full maturity? And also I'll take that first question, then I'll ask the second part.
Okay. Full maturity, I would say they can start bearing in their 5th to 6th leaf, depending on how well you treat the trees. I believe they can start to alternate bear once they get to their 9th leaf, which is, they start to alternate bear once they get that full crop.
Okay. And the second part of that question was also, how do pistachios differ compared to almonds with respect to frost impact during bloom?
Well, pistachios bloom a lot later than almonds do. I think I forgot to mention that in the bloom period. So I would say that they are less vulnerable to it just because we're less likely to have freezing temperatures during that period.
Luke Millerone asks, how does severe water stress in the current season impact the next year?
It's going to do it through reduced photosynthesis, reducing the number of clusters per tree, and it can reduce tree growth as well. And I think it can increase bud abscission as well.
Okay. Let's see. Then you got somebody that just said, thanks, Phoebe. Great.
Thank you.
Somebody wants to know how they can get more research details about bud abscission.
Well, you can go into the primary scientific literature. If that's not your jam, I would say, I don't know, has anyone written an extension article on bud abscission? I know there was a really nice review paper published in 2020 that went over alternate bearing and what we know so far. And so I guess if someone's interested, they can email me and I'm happy to share that article with them. But I don't know if anyone's written an extension article on it.
No, that was Eliezer Goldschmidt, and he wrote a complete review of alternate bearing in multiple crops for the symposium on alternate bearing in Sicily. Maybe could you explain, because you've had a couple questions here, what that I in alternate bearing for alternate bearing index is, how it's calculated? There's been a couple questions about that.
I would have to look that up. I can go in the break, I can go put the equation in the chat if people are interested.
Okay. Here is another question. Well, well, we lost trees with freezing temperatures, and we irrigate late in the season, like the third week of October. These pistachio trees act like car radiators. They take up the water. Oh, okay, this is somebody sharing his experience.
Okay.
He's just speaking with what happened to them. So basically saying late irrigation caused him a problem. Here's another one. On a new planted pistachio orchard, how much water do they need? Perhaps we could refer that to Craig in his lecture.
Yeah, I think Julie is going to be going over irrigating pistachios later on in the course. So all of those specific management questions will be answered later.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm looking for, that's an alternate bearing question. Here's somebody said, according to Craig's data, Lost Hills has less alternate bearing than Golden Hills. Again, I guess we could refer that to the Craig when he gets into that section.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, so I pulled this from one paper, but I think it's going to depend on the orchard as well. I think that 0.3 and 0.2 are pretty close as well. So, but yeah, I'm not disputing Craig's data at all. Yeah, it's going to depend on the conditions. Like I said, we don't understand alternate bearing fully. So yeah, I'm sure Craig's a good scientist. So.
And it might have something to do with rootstock, because now we've found there's differences in rootstock with alternate bearing.
Yeah.
Could freeze damage be related to nutrient deficiencies like zinc?
Short answer, I will say, I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to look that up. Long answer, I would say it's probably pretty likely, since in general, nutrient deficiencies make plants work less efficiently. That's why you lose yield and get poor growth with nutrient deficiency. So I don't know. So I guess I would just say, I don't know if there's been any nutrients off the top of my head that's been specifically linked to cold tolerance, but I could see that being a thing. In general, we don't want to let our trees get deficient.
Here's another one. Has leaf surface area measurement been implicated in carbohydrate reserves with pistachios as it has in almonds?
I don't know. I guess you're the plant physiologist, Louise. Do you know the answer to that?
No, there's not been a great deal of work about, Dr. Crane and James Walper did some, but there has not been good definitive work about leaf area relative to fruit crop load on a branch. I think that's something Julia Marino might be looking at in the future.
Okay.
And here's a last question, because then I think it's time for break. Does water stress impact beyond the second year yield? Does water stress impact beyond second year yield or not? Meaning not just the next season, but the year after? Like with almonds, it can impact trees' longevity if even a single year of drought occurs.
I don't know. I would think that if you're, especially in the establishment period, in general, you want to get canopy closure, well, as close to that as you can get to get that leaf surface area. So anything that's going to reduce growth in leaf surface area will definitely reduce yield in general, because you're not going to have as much leaf area. And I guess I don't know if pistachios in particular, but in general in trees, when you have that terminal bud forming, it's forming, based on conditions in the current year. And so if it's really stressed, there's not going to be as much growth potential in that terminal bud. So I'll say probably, but I'm not aware of any studies that have definitely implicated it. And I think, I know Dave Goldhammer did some work looking at really severe water stress, but I haven't looked at that paper in a long time.
So everybody, it's now time. Thank you, Phoebe. Phoebe and Bob, there are still questions in the Q&A if you'd like to go in and answer them or refer them to who you think could. Everybody, it's now break time. We expect you back here, but 1 or 2 minutes before 9:45 to hear regional considerations in pistachio growing presented by Dr. Catherine Jarvis Sheen, the Yolo Solano County Farm Advisor. Thank you. See you in 15 minutes. Okay, everybody, Our next talk is by the Yolo Solano Tree Crop Farm Advisor, Dr. Catherine Jarvis Sheen, and she is going to be speaking on regional consideration in growing pistachios. It's going to, Catherine, are you ready?
I am, yeah. Can you guys hear me? Oh, okay.
Yep.
Great. Let's do this. Good morning. All right. So yeah, as Louis said, I'm Kat Jarvis-Sheehan. I'm the tree crop advisor in Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties, and we're going to be going over regional considerations for pistachio production. And this is really, in some ways, Phoebe teed this up really nicely, giving a whole course on plant physiology in 45 minutes. So putting some numbers to a lot of concepts that she talked about, and then also teeing up a lot of what will be discussed in the rest of the course. Great. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk, just give a little context for this, thinking about where our current production areas are. Then we're going to go into annual climatic considerations. So looking at the annual calendar of pistachio growth and how different weather events can impact these different phenological stages. Then we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at the whole life of the orchard and big considerations for different regions on a lifetime of the orchard scale. So what you see here for context is on the left, the map from the ACP of 2019 bearing acreage of pistachio. So obviously that's bearing acreage. There's a little more than that when we include non-bearing acreage, but it gives us a starting point. So the green little dots are each individual orchard of pistachios, and you see really a light dusting of or a sprinkling of pistachio orchards up here in my area in the Sac Valley, and really a heavy concentration in the southern San Joaquin. When we look at the actual numbers, this bears out as well. So the graph on the left shows we've got about 6,000 acres of bearing acres in the Sac Valley. That gets up to around 11,000 in Merced. Then as you get into Madera, Fresno, that really kicks up, and Tulare, Kern, and especially Kings dominating the littoral field. So that's where most of us are. Most pistachio acreage is in the southern San Joaquin, but there are, it's possible to grow pistachios in the whole Central Valley. There's just different considerations based on where you're growing, pluses and minuses to different areas. So if we think about this on an annual basis, we have, the different stages of the crop. We have bloom here in April, plus or minus a little bit of time depending on your variety. Then we're growing the nuts as we get into the growing season in May, June, and July, and August. Then around September, again, depending on variety, this timing can change a little bit. We're harvesting our nuts, and then we're in the leaves drop, we get into winter dormancy. So vulnerabilities of these different stages to different climatic impacts. Rainfall can be a problem during bloom because we have a wind pollinated crop. And so if we get rain while that pollen is in the air, that can make it a problem for it to actually get to the female flowers. Then during the growing season, rainfall on the nuts or on the leaves or on the wood can increase susceptibility to diseases, can complete that disease triangle. Rainfall during harvest would be a problem, but it's not something we confront much here. So then we get past rain considerations into temperature considerations. So during the growing season, we're concerned about the temperature because it drives the development of the fruit, but it also drives the development of pests that like to eat that fruit, like navel orange worm. So that's a problem that we're going to talk about. And then when we get into dormancy, we're worried about getting enough cold temperatures or not having too much hot conditions, so that these trees can count up enough winter, that winter has passed, and that it's safe for their little flower buds and leaf buds to come out. So I'm going to be referring to temperature records from a couple of different stations throughout this talk to really give a sense of the broad gradient of conditions in the valley. So I'm going to be using data from Durham up here in the northern Sac Valley, Davis here in the southern Sac Valley, Firebaugh in Fresno, and then the Bell Ridge station as well. So these are old, some of the oldest CIMA stations that we have, the longest data records. So when we're talking about rainfall, we can see here, this is the average over 20 years on a monthly basis. April, we've got a lot of rainfall up here in the north, in Durham and Davis, and then less rainfall during bloom as we go south. So if you're in these areas trying to grow pistachios where you have more rainfall during April, maybe think about listening into Craig Coulson's talk on cultivars, in particular male cultivars, and sort of hedging your bets with multiple males in your orchard. As we get into the growing season, May, June, July, and August, rainfall makes us more susceptible to diseases, right? We know we have that disease triangle of the host, the pathogen, and the conditions. And the conditions are really that rainfall can complete that triangle. So, you know, not a lot across the board, not a lot of rainfall in July and August, but certainly more vulnerability to disease up here in the north in May. So if you're in that sort of vulnerable condition, definitely want to listen into Themis Michaelides is giving a talk on fungal diseases later in the program. And then we get into September harvest, not really a lot of vulnerability for us for rainfall, but certainly in other production areas like Australia. So that's rainfall and vulnerability to rainfall. Let's talk a little bit about heat during the growing season. So this, Phoebe talked about this some as well in her talk, and I think we'll be hearing about it more later in the program. But part of the issue, really the biggest issue with our concern with heat is that it drives the development of the nut. So what you see here on the bottom of this graph on the left is thermal units since flowering. So basically a nerd way of counting how much heat those trees have experienced since bloom. And on the right, we have from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% on the top, progress towards finishing a stage of growth. So we see this, this first red line, the volume of the nut, so basically how big the shell is, that is established pretty early. This is that stage 1 development stage that Phoebe was talking about, and is temperature driven. The firmness of the nut, also temperature driven, excuse me, of the shell. And that comes, this is with Kerman, so that comes before the embryos have really lengthened. And then finally, we have embryo length, and this is temperature driven as well. And the reason that this is important is because we find that it's really essentially the meat within the shell pries that shell open, and that is how we get those splits, is by having adequate embryo length or like meat length, nut length within that shell. And research that Louise Ferguson's lab has done has found that essentially once you get over a certain threshold, every I think it's every 100 hours of heat units, that's it. 100 hours of heat units gets you an increase, a 10% increase in your split rate. So this then matters as we look at the heat unit accumulation throughout the Central Valley. So the more heat we get during the growing season, well, I should say the less heat we get, we have delayed development and we have poor splits. We need a maximum of this 242,400 heat units to get our ideal kernel weight. This is a rough number. This varies a little bit by variety. And every 100 heat unit hour or heat units above 2000, we get an increase of 1% of splits. So again, we circle back to Durham, Davis, Firebaugh, and Belridge. This is just over the last 3 years, not starting from their flowering date precisely, but just starting from April 1st. And we see that broadly speaking, as we go from north to south, we have much higher heat accumulation and thus we have higher splits. And this bears out if we look at the records from processors. So this is not exactly split percentage. This is the percentage of weight that's in closed shells versus the total weight, but it's a similar measurement to split percentages. And we see in the Sac Valley, which is this blue line on top, a higher percentage of our production is in closed shell weights relative to the total production. And that number is pretty stable and lower in the San Joaquin Valley. Now, as Phoebe alluded to in her presentation, this also varies by variety. So this is one of the reasons that we have a lot of golden hills going in up here in the north. So again, these are some vulnerabilities to different conditions that you can think about and plan through early in the life, when you're planning your orchard. So heat drives those nuts and the growth of those nuts, but it also drives the growth of pests that eat those nuts, like navel orangeworm. So when we have warmer conditions, we have earlier biofix. We also have more generations of those nuts. The growing conditions can also influence the ease of sanitation, getting into the orchard, how well those nuts degrade on the orchard floor. So if we use the navel orangeworm degree day model that you can find on the UC IPM website, we find that we all get a lot of heat accumulation. This is just a sampling of 2 different years, but really, especially sometimes Firebaugh, and especially the really southern San Joaquin down in Belridge gets a lot more growing degree hours in terms of navel orangeworm. And that this means if we're 1,050 hours for each generation of navel orangeworm, roughly speaking, that in Durham and Davis, by the end of September, you will fit in 3 generations of navel orangeworm, whereas in Firebaugh and Belridge, you'll fit in 4 generations of navel orangeworm. So more generations, different timing. So if you're in this sort of vulnerability of more warmth leading to more navel orangeworm, definitely listen into Houston Wilson's talk on navel orangeworm later in the program. So that's heat considerations and thinking about the implications of it being warmer in the San Joaquin than in the Sac Valley. Now let's talk about chill considerations, or how cold it is during winter. So why this matters, and Phoebe again kind of teed some of this up. We know that trees need a certain amount of winter cold over winter to be convinced that winter is past and that it's safe for their vulnerable flower buds and leaf buds to come out. And certainly, so this is a matter of both getting enough cold and not getting too much heat, as Phoebe talked to, and Craig Carlson and Maciej Zwiniecki have been finding. So when these trees don't get enough chill, we get delayed bloom, we get poor male overlap, we get increased blanks. So this is, we can see here, this is in the spring of 2014 after a particularly warm recent winter. And you can see, so a lot of these buds just don't come out at all. You can also see some very large leaves and some very small leaves from buds that are just starting to emerge, meaning we have this a broader window of timing when these buds are breaking. That means then some nuts start the race earlier than others, so they finish the race earlier than others. A broader window of maturity timing, which can lead to multiple shakes, increased costs for doing that, increased vulnerability to navel orange worm. None of these are things that we like. And so we have a couple of different ways about, talking about how we count chill, as Phoebe said. I'm going to go into this much, much more in a talk that I'm giving at the very end of the short course on the very last day about how warmer winters might affect production in the future. And at that time, I'll be going into these different chill models, but suffice to say for now that we have a couple of different ways that we count chill. The chill portions model or dynamic model, which is coming more into favor because it does better with mild conditions. And the chill hours model, which is a simpler, the traditional model we've used in the industry for a long time. But both of these models, as you go again from north on the top of the graph to south on the bottom of the graph, show more chill accumulation up north than down south. So the blue line here is the 5-year average from the last 5 years. And the red line is one of the more recent mild winters or warm winters that we've had. So on average, and also when things are pretty bad, we see more chill in the north, less chill in the south. And I know not everyone's super familiar with the chill portions or dynamic model. So I've just highlighted here with these dashed lines roughly where you want to be for Kerman, both in chill portions and in chill hours. So we see that in the north, we do a pretty good job most of the time of meeting this chill requirement, but certainly especially in marginal winters, falling short in the south of the valley. The other thing, and Phoebe also talked about this, is winter juvenile dieback. Now I want to say that this, so this has to do with very cold conditions, where freezing conditions, sort of where freezing air settles, cold air settles. So this is more about topography than a north to south basis. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, speaking of topography, I wanted to highlight here, this is a north to south consideration with winter chill. But also I hear, because of this concern about juvenile dieback, that there's some acreage that's sort of going up up in elevation into the banana belt to avoid that freezing. If you're avoiding colder temperatures to get away from freezing, you're probably also making yourself vulnerable to not getting a chill. So that's something to think about. Okay, back to this juvenile dieback. Phoebe teed this off again. So we have these young trees that generally, if they haven't gone dormant all the way, and we get a cold event in November or December. So sort of based on topography, and even within an orchard where the cold cold air will settle. So that's our climatic considerations. Let's zoom out a little bit to look at the whole life of the orchard. So thinking about, definitely for the whole life of that orchard, you need high quality water and enough water. So this varies throughout the state. We know that pistachios need at least 42 inches of water to achieve their maximum production, that they can get by with less, but that this will impact their yield. And that they may need more water if you're looking at poorer quality water, so that you can be leaching that water out. Also because of what Phoebe was talking about of the salts kind of holding that water tight in the soil and making it harder for the roots to take them up. And then source issues matter regionally as well. How close to the surface your groundwater is, how much groundwater you have available to pump, and availability to surface water. So that rainfall that was pernicious and problematic for us in bloom time in the North Valley works in our favor when it comes to meeting the irrigation requirement of the trees. So we have more rainfall during the winter in the Sac Valley, which is then stored in the soil, which we come into the season with, which the trees can draw upon, and less in the south. Also, this is a map from the Department of Water Resources looking at the basin priorities under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So I would say no one can put their feet up in terms of this throughout the Central Valley, but we have most of the San Joaquin in these critical overdraft basins, and most of the Sac Valley in either high but not overdrafted or medium priority basins. So this is reflective of groundwater tables that are generally closer, not as depleted in the North State, and that refill more quickly following droughts. And so that's a lot of that is, again, a sort of gradient from going from north to south. But then when we think about soil quality, it's not a north to south matter. It has a lot more to do with the history of the soil development. So what you see here on the right is a map that shows different soil orders. So a pretty high level of how we classify soils. And you see a lot of variability in what soil order you're working with. This is largely because they have different histories of being made by different geological factors, influences. So on the west side, be it in the Sac Valley or the San Joaquin Valley, more influenced by the coastal range and degradation of the coastal range. And then on the east side, more influenced by degradation of the Sierras and water coming down from the Sierras, bringing sediment and that sort of thing. Then also, the history of the Tulare Lake Basin in the south, the influence of that, history of big flooded rivers in the north. So this all means that we have different soils in different areas. These heavier soils that we have, certainly in the Sac Valley and in some areas in the San Joaquin, can get saturated quite easily. So May Cullenber is going to be talking about that when we're looking at an orchard site. So listen in on that talk. We can have high water tables, especially there's a lot of wildcatting going on in the Delta right now because of water availability in there, but we might have too much water. So having water tables that can endanger the health of your root system with either just anoxia, not getting oxygen, or fungal disease growth. And then especially on the west side, we have issues of salinity and alkalinity, toxicity levels in terms of sodium and fluoride and boron. I think that certainly in my area, this is actually, this is what's driving pistachio development in my area up here in this little oval, because people want to plant a nut crop, and relative to almonds and walnuts, pistachios eat boron for breakfast, and we've got a lot of boron up here, but certainly they have their limits too. So you need to be checking out where you are relative to those limits as you develop an orchard. Okay, to sort of wrap up here then, there's really no such thing as a perfect site. Each area has its own complications that you need to think through as you're developing an orchard. Management of many, if not most of these issues is possible, but you need to be thinking about it ahead of time. For winter chill, for heat accumulation, for splits, those are things that we can manage with different cultivar options. And for when it comes to water and soil, there's options you need to think about, but very early in the life of the orchard, how you're developing, if you have berms, et cetera, et cetera. And really thinking about decisions both with current conditions, and I'll put a plug in for my very last talk on the last day of the course, thinking about future conditions as well. So yeah, so we have that gradient of water, drier as we go north to south, warmer as we go north to south, which is good for splits, bad for navel orangeworm. Again, not as cool, so warmer again during the winter as we go north to south, which can be problematic for chill. and then a huge variability in terms of soil and our groundwater and water availability. So that is what I have for you guys. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Okay. Catherine, you've got some questions. Somebody asked, what are multiple shakes?
Sure, thanks. So by multiple shakes, I mean, we shake the trees to get the nuts off of them at harvest. And if you have a wide bloom window following a low chill winter, that means that you'll also have a wide window of maturity. So some nuts that will be ready to harvest earlier than other nuts. And so, but you want to get those early nuts off so they don't fall on the ground, and also so that navel orangeworm doesn't start munching away at them. So you want to get those out early, which means then you have to, you want to get them off the tree, so you have to come back again and shake the whole orchard again.
Thank you. Next question here. Is it known what reduction in yield correlates to a specific reduction in percentage of chill hours?
That's a great question. I'm going to be talking a lot about that on the very last, I think it'll actually be the very last talk of the course. So I'll punt that a little bit to then. But I will say that a lot of work is going into this right now in terms of how we can help these trees compensate for those low chill winters. So it's not an exact, we don't have an exact answer, and we're trying to help find out how we can adapt to that and get not as low a yield impact.
Okay, here's another one. Could you explain the chill effects that result in blank nuts?
Yeah, so that relates back to what Phoebe was saying, is that we get these the female flower will sort of start growing the nut regardless of whether the pollen has shown up or not to make the meat inside, and that's how we get a blank nut. And a big part of the problem that we have with winter chill in California, or that we had in the last two low chill winters, following the last two low chill winters, is in some areas Kerman still like snuck by and did okay, but we had only Peters as a pollinator variety in those orchards, and Peters has a higher chill requirement than Kerman does. So I'll show a picture of this in my future presentation, but there were often, like you could see that the Kerman trees in the orchard had gone well past the flowers being receptive to pollen, and that was just when the Peters was waking up to give pollen. So we got those blank nuts because the females actually got through the mild winter, but the pollen from the males was not there on time to pollinate the nuts.
Okay, here's another one. What is the ideal soil for pistachios? You might want to punt that to May, but I say it now.
Yeah, again, I think there's not one ideal soil type. There's a lot of different things that go into making a soil good or bad. We have clayier soils here in the Sac Valley, which can make them get more easily saturated, but also means they hold nutrients more and don't need to be kept as close an eye on when it comes to irrigation. Whereas if you're in a sandier soil, you need to pay closer attention to really spoon feeding soil, nutrients and water. So there's not a perfect one. I would say more that there are a few soil types that the heavier the soil, the harder it is to get it to drain, and that's problematic for root health. And certainly I think May is going to talk about soil strata, and if you have limitations to water clearing out of that root zone.
Okay. Here's another. Is there a way to fight against spring frost?
Is there a way to fight against spring frost? I think the biggest tool in the toolbox for fighting against spring frost is our variety selection. So picking a variety that is not out there and vulnerable during when these frosts usually occur. I have not, I'm curious if this question might be coming from outside of California, because that's not something that I am asked a lot from growers around here. It's more that freeze or frost or like cold conditions in November, early December with the winter juvenile dieback that are a problem for us.
Okay. We have poor bloom between, actually, I think they mean between female and male trees. For that question, do you have any experience using hydrogen cyanamide?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this in that talk at the end of the short course as well. Me, myself personally, I haven't done this work, but Louise Ferguson and Bob Beatty did some of this work in California, looking at hydrogen cyanamide, which is the chemical name for Dormex. People might be more familiar with that name. And certainly it is, it has an effect. It's not currently labeled for pistachio usage. My understanding, talking to the company that sells Dormex, is they're working on getting it labeled for California, but it's not available for use in California right now.
Yeah. So with that, Catherine, there are more questions for you in the Q&A if you would like to go in and answer them. But
Great.
It is now time for, well, actually, I guess we could continue it unless people want a break. Because it is, excuse me, I forgot it was break
time.
We're going right
Okay.
into May.
What I would recommend, Louise, is those
Yes.
that need to take their break can go ahead now. The next talk will start at the designated time, which I believe
10:30.
10:30. And then Kat, if you're okay to stay on, Louise, you can proctor the rest of the questions to her, and anyone that wants to stay and not take a break can hear her answers to the questions.
Okay, well then I'll keep asking you questions, Catherine. They'd like to know, and maybe you'll do this later, the difference between the chill hour and the chill portion model.
Yeah, I love talking about this. So yeah, I will go into this in the talk that I'm giving on the last day, but the basic points are the chill hours model is very simple, which is nice. It makes it intuitive. It's something that we've used since before we had computers. It's just any hour between freezing and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The chill portions model is more complicated, but that's good because trees are more complicated than the basic chill hours model. So the chill hours model does the chill portions model, which is also called the dynamic model, does a couple of different things. So one is it gives varying weights of like values, chill values to different temperatures. So it's not, oftentimes we'll say like, oh, we had so many chill hours, but some of them were warm chill hours. So I don't know how much that's worth. But this model says what a warm chill hour versus a cold chill hour is worth. It has a broader range of temperatures that it gives chill value to. So instead of freezing to 45, it goes freezing to 54, which we find in our mild conditions actually works better. And the last thing is that it subtracts chill value when trees experience heat. So what Phoebe was talking about, this concept of warm winter temperatures setting the trees back, impacting yield that Craig has found, impacting carbohydrates, which Maciej Zwiniecki's lab has found. So it has a way for that impact. So different values for different temperatures, broader range of temperatures, and subtracting for the influence of warm days. Those are the big differences.
Another question, which I answered, I tapped something in and answered it, but they'd like to know why there's so few pistachios planted between Merced and Sacramento.
Yeah, so the two big reasons for that are the lower amount of warmth during the growing season, leading to lower splits, and rainy conditions, especially in that in the Delta Gap, getting a lot more rainfall during bloom and during the growing season, leading to more vulnerability with disease management.
Yeah, and actually to add to that, the first case of Alternaria alternata Joe Grant and I ever saw was, I've forgotten exactly where it was, but it was in that region.
Yeah. London region.
Here, if 42 inches of water is required for maximum production, safe to say you can decrease the amount of water use during an off year.
Ooh, I'm gonna definitely punt that to
Julia.
the water talks that are gonna be happening later. But I would say, yeah, I'll let Julia handle that.
What's the best time of year to plant new trees?
We have another talk on that too, don't we?
Craig Kelson,
Yeah.
orchard development tomorrow or
Yeah,
Thursday.
I'll let Craig handle that.
Okay, let's see. Oh, here's somebody that just wanted to comment that with climate change, what appears to be climate change going on, Stockton will soon become a major production area. Should pistachios be planted on berms?
Again, that depends on the soil conditions that you're working with. If we're in a, if you have a fairly heavy soil that you're concerned about draining well in the spring, then it's worth considering. You know, you gotta also keep thinking about the equipment that's gonna be getting in there to harvest that, if having how high your berm is, and if that's gonna influence accessibility of your shaker. But I think there's valid reasons to consider it.
Okay. Is clay soil good for pistachios?
I would say like 100% clay, certainly not, but you know, we have clay loams here that grow very great pistachios. So if it's a clay loam, yes. If it's a really heavy clay, then I would be more concerned about root health.
And here appears to be a last one. Is there any support or opposition to a fall post-harvest zinc spray to cause an early dormancy?
Great question. This is something that we've been noodling over. And Maciej Zwieniecki, who's leading this carbohydrate observatory, has been building enough data to start answering that question. But the concern is that if you force those leaves to fall before the tree wants them to naturally fall, you might not be reclaiming all the carbohydrates that you can get out of those leaves, which would mean they don't have a lot of energy going into the spring, or as much energy as they could have. But certainly the other side of the argument is maybe you're actually triggering the start of dormancy and forcing that earlier by making the leaves fall. So we don't have a good question, we don't have a good answer to that yet, because there's really ways you can see it working out both ways. But we're looking into it as a way to explore more how to adapt to these warmer winters that we're getting.
And a lot of these questions that are being given to Catherine and Phoebe are things that really will be addressed in more detail. Here's another
We're
one.
not just dodging them. We're like,
exactly.
Yeah.
We have people who know even more.
Yeah.
Catherine, what are your thoughts on orchards against the foothills on the eastern side of Madera and Fresno? I think he's referring to the banana belt.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think, you know, generally all of our nut crops are moving up into these foothill areas as land is getting more expensive, and we're just kind of pushing the boundaries. Yeah, so what Louise referred to, I would also be concerned about, that you want to make sure that you're getting enough chill at that elevation, and that you're not up in that sort of banana belt area that doesn't get enough winter chill. Other than that, you know, if you're in rolling topography, you also want to consider, are there any swales where cold air would settle that you would have vulnerability to this winter juvenile dieback problem? And that's some things that you could probably move some earth around to avoid. Again, it's not, yeah, I wouldn't say that it's out of the question. There's just some things you might need to pay more attention to that other people don't.
Well, I think you're going to get a break, Catherine. It's 10:24 and I don't see any more questions. Thank you very much. Very good
All
talk.
right, great. Thanks for all those great questions, everyone.
Everybody will be back in approximately 5 minutes to get ready to hear Dr. May Columber address site selection, location, evaluation, modification, water quality, salinity management, and reclamation.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Louise. My name is May Columber. I am a nut crop advisor with University of California in Fresno. And as Louise mentioned, I'm gonna give you an overview about some important information about site selection, how to evaluate the location where you want to plant pistachios, what are some things to consider to modify the soil, what to do about problems with water quality, managing for salinity, and some possible reclamation solutions. So when we're going to evaluate a site, we want to know what the potential is for uniformity, rapid maturation of the orchard, achieving quality nuts of good size and high yields. So what do we need to evaluate to make that assessment? Well, first, we need to have a good understanding of the pistachio crop or whatever crop it is that we're considering planting on the land that we would like to farm. We need to understand the life cycle of the pistachios, generally about what the water use needs are going to be, the rooting characteristics of the crop, the spacing, what kind of canopy structure we need to achieve to get those high yields we're going for, the harvesting requirements, what are those requirements in terms of who you might have to use if you're going with a custom harvester, and what equipment you'll have available, and understand what the necessary space buffering might be to accommodate that equipment. So you need to think about all those type of things with consideration to the land you're evaluating. Very importantly, the water supply, the reliability of the water supply for the long term, and understanding what the potential costs are associated with the water. We also need to evaluate the cost and understand the limitations that may be posed by the soil texture, as well as the soil and water chemistry, and how this might relate to how well the field is going to drain and what modifications or amendments are going to be necessary to accomplish those goals. So in regard to that, a final consideration would be for the development, the cost of land leveling, installing the proper irrigation system given the conditions, the energy that's going to be required to pump the water, the irrigation method that's most suitable given what you know about the characteristics of the soil and water after you've done that research. Another good place to start are with our UC cost to establish studies. We have a new one that will be available soon for the Southern San Joaquin Valley. And these cost studies give you a general idea of what are your initial production decisions that you need to make when installing an orchard. You need to determine what your potential returns are. This can help you with preparing budgets and evaluate production loans. But it's just to be used as a guide, but this may be a good place to start from the beginning. In terms of capital investment concerns, there was some discussion in the previous session about, what's the ideal piece of ground to grow pistachios on, and a lot of that might depend on, what your initial investment abilities are. So inexpensive ground and the cost of land can vary very widely. So these are just, meant to be given as an example. But if you're looking at maybe say like a $7,000 per acre piece of ground, that would be considered relatively inexpensive, you may have a lot of hidden costs in the type of modifications that you might need to use with soil amendments in these first few years, and then account for some cumulative yield losses that you might get on that poorer pieces of ground compared to more expensive ground that has, you know, a higher initial investment up front, but you're going to need less amendments. So just as an example, you know, your final cost per acre for expensive ground could be pretty close to what you're paying for that inexpensive ground over the long term. So here, a cost comparison of what the total cost is going to be for installing, say, a 150 acre plot with 121 trees per acre is getting close to up to $2 million. A lot of people, you know, may not want to take the time to do the initial soil evaluation cost, but when you're looking at what that cost is relative to the cost of installing the orchard, it's only about 0.1% of your initial capital. So it really pays to evaluate the soil. Soil testing can help us understand the orchard soil environment, how you need to correct for potential nutrient deficiencies, toxicities, and other conditions that affect the availability of water to trees. The cost of the water and soil analyses is, as I mentioned, very small, about $2,100 in comparison to the cost of the initial installation. So when considering the land that you want to develop, a good place to start could be looking at historical images, if you can get a hold of those. And this can provide some idea of the problems from previously planted permanent crops that were either influenced by the inherent soil and water conditions, or some things can have more to do with the way that the ground was managed. So in the image here, to me, it looks as though flood irrigation has caused saturated conditions at the head of the field, which suggests a new planting using that same irrigation system with flood would maybe need to give attention to land leveling before going ahead with the next orchard installation. Some other useful tools you can start with online. The University of California Soil Web the Soil Resource Lab website, and you can find the link here at the top right hand of the screen. So this can provide you with several useful resources to familiarize yourself with the region where you are looking to plant. You can use this information to delineate the best locations to soil sample and give you hints about what you might need to consider in terms of site modification. There are two app features that I'm going to show you. The first is the Soil Web Earth app, which is on the right side of the screen here, circled. And when linking on that, this assumes that you have Google Earth installed on your computer. So if you were to click on the Soil Web Earth, this will help you to download the .kmz file, which you can open in Google Earth, or another software that can process these keyhole markup files. And the layer that you will see in Google Earth, it provides these lines that distinguish general boundaries of soil types, and gives you some background information about some of the characteristics of the soil through the root zone. Another nice thing about the Google Earth feature is that you can look at historical imagery and see how these characteristics, the soil information, corresponds to some historical land use and how successful previous crops were on that piece of land. This is a nice, helpful tool, but the information from this survey is not as complete as what is provided by the Soil Web survey, which is on the left-hand side of the browser. And this can actually just be run in your browser. So this does not require having Google Earth installed on your computer. And the Soil Web browser provides more detailed information for you to clearly distinguish between soil types that may exist on the landscape. It can give you some information about the suitability for agricultural crops, and just a clearer picture of this changing soil characteristics with depth in the soil where the trees will be rooted. So these web-based tools they're a nice point and click option to get a general idea about what challenges you may encounter with your pistachio development, but these surveys may not match your ground observation. So it's really necessary to ground truth assumptions you may have about the conditions, such as perched water tables, a tendency for the soil to saturate, things that could reduce tree performance. And so this table here is for those two soil types that I had in the previous aerial imagery as an example, a Calfax clay loam and a Lethant clay loam. These would be fairly common soil types that we might see in the Kings County region of the southern San Joaquin Valley. And again, some of that web soil survey data may not match ground observations when you get in. So this is definitely not, those surveys are not a replacement for doing on the ground analysis before planting. And so one example in particular could be the EC levels that may be reported in some of those surveys. The values on the ground could actually be much greater. And this could be due to the influence that the agricultural land management and irrigation has had on the accumulating salinity levels through decades of agricultural production. So, so there's a few different tools that can help to assist with soil sampling to complete a survey. Backhoe pits are probably the most intensive in terms of resources to do a survey, but it allows you to go deep in the soil profile to maybe about 6 feet. If you want to get a lot of sampling points for reference, it's good to also have just hand augers or even a step soil probe so that you can gather samples, in that 1 to 2 foot range. So I'm going to give a brief overview of a lot of different soil parameters that you could look at, but just in a nutshell, 3 very important analyses may be the saturation percentage. Saturation percentage is a determination of the water content of the soil at saturation. And this is very useful for characterizing soil texture, actually. So when you get that analysis back, you can look at, how does at the surface, how does the soil texture change? Generally speaking, very sandy soils will have saturation percentage values that are, less than 20%. Sandy loam to loam soils have values between 20 and 35, and a clay loam and clay soils would generally have values over 35%. So in the example here, this would be considered a very high clay loam soil. pH is the measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in the soil, and soil pH is is a good indication of what your nutrient availability will be. So I would say, as far as the ideal soil type for pistachios, or for any crop for that matter, would be a pH range between 6.5 and 7.5 on the pH scale. But because pistachios have a higher tolerance, we do find those plantings can be successful even upwards of a pH of 8, as is the example here. pH can also be indicative of the presence of bicarbonates in the soil. And I will go more into detail on bicarbonates a little later in the talk. But usually, generally speaking, you have higher pH. This is going to decrease nutrient availability, particularly for micronutrients like manganese, iron, and maybe copper. Electrical conductivity provides you an indication of the salt levels in the soil. And I'm probably going to hit on this several times through the talk. Levels greater than about 4.5 to 6 decisiemens per meter are where we start to see that gradual decline in yields over time through the lifetime of the orchard. Okay, so using that information that you could gather from those soil web resources, this is really useful to develop a sampling scheme for the field. So determine, where do I want to take these sampling points to get an overall picture of what I'm looking at with this field, what kind of modifications need to be used. So as I mentioned, that soil probe or augers can be useful to get these composite samples from that 0 to 1 foot or maybe 1 to 2 foot depths. And generally speaking, you want at least 8 holes, 50 feet apart for each soil type. A backhoe is going to allow you to sample much deeper, to 6 feet. And that's usually recommended that you have at least 1 backhoe pit for each soil type on the proposed planting area. If you know prior to planting, if the surface vegetation and soil pit profiles are really similar at the same depths, you can composite samples together from different auger holes or different soil pits to get a better average for, say, a 40-acre zone. Here's a backhoe beginning to dig a soil pit. And these are some of the tools that you want to consider to have with you when doing a backhoe pit to classify it. You need some shovel, a geologist's hammer pick is really useful, a measuring tape, screwdrivers to delineate stratification boundaries in the soil that you might note, clipboard to take some notes, and buckets and bags to collect soil samples. And this picture just shows, some of the different soil characteristics that you may encounter. Generally speaking, throughout the San Joaquin Valley and Central Valley, we'll see stratified soils that vary between having more of a coarse, granular, sandy texture with stuff that's a little bit heavier in clays. So collecting samples at depth of soil pits in the picture here, you don't see a measuring tape, but this would be an example of using that geologist pick to cleave off some soil samples into a bag for different incremental depths in the soil. So when you're in that soil pit, you want to take notes and pictures to remember best you can those features that you're seeing that you're going to need to consider when you go back and say, okay, these are the type of land modifications that we're going to need to use. These are the type of amendments we're going to need to use to get the ground most suitable, a nice environment for our tree roots to thrive and grow. Okay, so what are we evaluating when we're in that soil pit? I'm just going to go through a list of different soil characteristics here. First, I'm going to talk about texture. We'll hit on structure, how to evaluate the permeability of the soil, how to identify those stratified layers, identifying potential drainage issues and how to address that, and then finally evaluating salinity and fertility. So starting with soil texture, generally speaking, there are benefits and trade-offs with different textures, but with these heavier clay soils, we tend to have better water holding capacity, which would be considered good. But then we're also going to be seeing potentially decreases in our infiltration rates. So we may need to be worried more about saturated conditions. Whereas in the sandier texture soils, we have lower water holding capacity, but generally tend to have better infiltration rates. So one thing that you can do when characterizing those different layers, and when you're in the soil pit, you can distinguish layers, or you can take measured increments based on the changes you're seeing in the soil, or you can do it, say, in 1 foot increments and take notes that way. it's just dependent on your preference. Sometimes looking at things on that incremented 1 foot scale down to 5 or 6 feet, however deep you can go in the soil, is a good standard way to take a look at the soil. But you also might want to take a measurements of where do I see those changes in stratification in the soil. So when you're in each one of those layers, you want to see if you can estimate the texture by hand. And so this is a nice method that takes some skill to develop, where you moisten a ball of soil and you make a ribbon with it in your hand if possible. And so that length of the ribbon can tell you generally, is this more clay-based soil, or does this, is this more sandy? Just really kind of getting your hands on it to get a feel. And then as the orchard is developed and planted, and then you're irrigating, most everyone nowadays use some type of soil moisture sensing equipment, but it's nice to be able to go back and have that as a skill, to be able to, hold the soil by hand and get an estimate of where your soil moisture is at. And that'll help you really fine tune your irrigation decisions. Structure, okay. So a good soil structure is important to allow air and water into the soil. And this, of course, is vital for healthy tree growth. Structure improves drainage, and it reduces soil erosion caused by surface runoff. Understanding the soil characteristics can provide an indication of how well the air and water circulate through the soil. Soil with a granular structure is generally loose. The soil particles are loose, they don't stick together. These are generally soils that will drain well, and they're usually found in the top layers of the soil. Soil with blocky structure drains moderately well. Generally, this is found in the subsurface of the soil. And then finally, soils that have this platy or massive soil structure, generally found deeper in the soil horizon of clay-based soils, and can provide a good indication of compacted areas that might restrict root growth and may drain very poorly, or maybe even provide a place for water to perch in the soil. So these are characteristics of the soil that in the soil pit with a trained eye, you can make these distinctions and see these characteristics. So as I just mentioned, structure will influence the permeability of the soil and the ability for water to move through the root zone. Heavy, more compacted soil will have a reduced permeability compared to soil with more granular structure that has more pore space between the particles. An important characteristic to note in the soil pit are the transitions between different soil layers that can impact the permeability of the soil on the whole. Infiltration tests can provide an idea of the speed at which water can permeate through the topsoil layers. I like to use a double ring infiltrometer when I'm measuring infiltration. This is a really worthwhile test to conduct when considering developing a pistachio orchard, because it can help you with choosing the appropriate irrigation system, or even the emitters that are going to best match the infiltration rate for your ground. If you have determined that you do have infiltration problems, some of this can be addressed with deep ripping before planting, calcium supply and amendments where appropriate, if some of these infiltration issues are not just based on textural limitations, but rather chemical problems that are have to do with the degraded soil structure. Other amendments, or organic amendments, can help with increasing infiltration and water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, and even cover crops definitely have been shown to have benefits. There's increasing amounts of annual ryegrasses, different annual cool season grasses just in general being used in our area, and really seems to help make a difference. Okay, so stratification, all of these are very, closely related concepts, but in the soil profile, it's good to distinguish different horizons. In the soil, you're just trying to picture, you know, how well your tree roots once planted, what kind of obstacles could they potentially run into in terms of physical obstacles or potentially obstacles with drainage. And so here's just an example of using that screwdriver to just say, okay, I'm in the soil pit, and here's a clear distinctive layer. Make a note of it, and then when we go in with the equipment, we know to what depth we need to do ripping or other modification. So here, sorry, sometimes I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. Okay, so here's an example of a soil profile opened up with a backhoe, showing a fine sandy silt layer with a high alkalinity stratified between two layers of clay loam. So in these circumstances, a slip plow may be advisable to use during soil modification to break up this layer to help with water infiltration through that layer. I will talk a little bit more about different equipment later. Drainage. In some areas, there may be very shallow confining clay layers that can cause water to perch within the root zone. So we want to use a lot of caution when considering planting into these areas. We don't want to risk the tree roots being exposed to this perched water, especially in areas that have problems with salinity. This water can be very hot. It could be upwards of 60 decisiemens per centimeter, depending on how shallow the water table is and the inherent saline conditions of the soil. This can kill young trees very quickly. So in these circumstances, it's really recommended that you use a monitoring well as a critical tool to monitor these shallow water tables in these areas. It's estimated that up to 250,000 acres along the west side of the San Joaquin Valley are affected by poor drainage and potentially have perched water and high levels of salinity. So this is potentially a real problem with micro irrigation systems. This can be controlled much easier, but in some areas of Fresno County, the Corcoran clay layer comes up to within 8 to 10 feet of the surface of the soil. So still something very, very real for consideration. So it's critical to identify these areas as irrigation management strategies. You'll need to keep this in mind for the potential that those rising water table levels can be very extremely concentrated in salts, as I mentioned, after rain events, flood irrigation, or along irrigation sets with other systems. Okay, so salinity and fertility. Operations that you need to make deeper in the soil profile that may not be possible once trees are in the ground. There are many different commercial labs in California. They all tend to use different formats. Use one lab that has consistent quality results in a format that you understand, and stick with it as long as it's working for you. Make sure that you submit your soil and water samples to a certified ag lab. Okay, so tree water use, as expressed as ET, evapotranspiration, and yield tend to go hand in hand. But increases in water use and yield tend to level off with increasing amounts of salinity very quickly. And pistachios are salt tolerant, but even they will reach a toxicity threshold and yields will begin to decline. So more recent research by Blake Sandin and Louise Ferguson indicates that 4.5 to 6 decisiemens per meter irrigation water may not be sustainable for the long-term productivity when combined with poor drainage circumstances. So you have that combination of high salt conditions along with potentially anoxic conditions is a recipe for poor tree growth and production. So here's just a graph just illustrating that relationship between yield and water use, which is some recent data coming from the Zachariah lab at UC Davis. Okay, so what to evaluate in terms of salinity? Okay, so the main characteristics to understand with regard to salinity are electrical conductivity, which is usually most soil reports, you'll see electrical conductivity. It can also be reported as total dissolved solids. pH, as I mentioned earlier, is an important indicator of nutrient availability and indicates the possibility of carbonates and more likely bicarbonates that can cause problems with irrigation systems clogging, as well as soil sealing and nutrient immobilization. We need to know about specific ions, most importantly boron, sodium, and chloride. High levels of these ions will first cause young trees osmotic stress, giving them problems with taking up water. And over time, they can accumulate to toxic levels actually in the tissues of the trees. SAR is the sodium absorption ratio. So this is a calculation that takes into account the proportion of sodium relative to calcium and magnesium. And it provides an important indication of the permeability of water at the soil surface. And then finally, the exchangeable sodium percentage is an important value to understand how to properly calculate the amendment rate to reclaim soil before planting. Okay, so young trees can be stunted early on. And I think that the other talks have hit on this a little bit, but the reason that this happens in saline condition is because these trees, they have a difficult time taking up water and transpiring due to that increased salt concentration in the soil. Those increased salt concentrations reduce the ability of the tree to pull water in by osmosis. As that salt pressure increases outside of the root over time, it eventually will become too much for the roots to exclude that salt, and that is when the trees will actually begin to accumulate those salts in their woody tissue. Okay, so just go over some classical guidelines for salinity tolerance thresholds. Okay, so I've mentioned EC and the osmotic stress, how that's going to interfere with water uptake. These are the guidelines for most irrigated permanent trees. So we tend to think that the threshold is actually going to be a bit higher for pistachio than what's listed here. And then that ratio of SAR to EC. Again, SAR is that indication that we have degrading soil structure conditions. And when we see a ratio that's about greater than 5, when SAR is about greater than 5 times the amount of EC in the water, we tend to see some problems with infiltration. And then finally, that specific ion toxicity, as I mentioned before, sodium chloride and boron, at higher levels, these can lead to toxicity, necrosis, and nutrient deficiencies, even in pistachio. Okay, so as I just mentioned in the last slide, that ratio of SAR to EC, when you generally exceed about a 5 times rate of higher SAR in proportion to the EC, we generally see reductions in infiltration. And so those are going to be some things that we can address with gypsum amendments or if appropriate, different acids. And then pH is also going to be a very important indicator of the possibility of carbonates in the soil. Is that lime precipitating? Do we need to address problems that we could have with clogging with our irrigation system, surface sealing of, and also the sealing of the soil at the surface? which could impede water infiltration. And then also, so that 6.5 to 7.5 range is, what we would consider optimal. And generally speaking, in California, we worry about going above 7.5 where we see micronutrient deficiencies, but there definitely are areas where we also have low pH conditions where we would also worry about some of the same issues. Okay, so what kind of research has been done about developing pistachio plantings using saline water? And what are some things you need to consider? So some historical work conducted by Blake Sandin and Louise Ferguson compared different types of water sources and their impact on developing trees in a new orchard. So they had some aqueduct water compared to a 50-50 blend of aqueduct and well water, and then mainly well water source. And you can see the EC range from very low with 0.5 with aqueduct, with the specific ions below a toxicity range. But then the blend in both the well have increasingly higher levels of EC and toxic ranges for that sodium chloride and boron. So throughout the study, they did observe marginal burns on the leaves. So this is something that you'll commonly see in pistachio orchards that are dealing with salinity issues. When you have more necrosis on your leaves, that's decreasing the potential for your trees to photosynthesize and produce and to accumulate the nutrition that's needed to support the crop. As the study continues, so as I mentioned, it was planted in 2005. So looking at tree growth of the rootstock from 2009 to 2013. And in the study, there was both PG1 and UCB1 rootstocks. We didn't see really any difference between the two rootstocks, but in terms of differences in response to the water quality, as the orchard got older, there were some differences in terms of the aqueduct, larger circumference on the rootstock. And then with looking at tree leaf tissue responses, the leaf tissue analyses after one growing season only found significantly higher levels of chloride and boron in the blended and well water trees compared to that receiving aqueduct water. When looking at the scion leaves of the Kerman, measured 4 to 8 years of age, they also had drastically higher levels in the chloride and boron as compared to the aqueduct sources of water. But as the study went on, even the boron levels in the aqueduct water trees were in the increasing toxicity range, which I'm sorry I'm not highlighting. And here on the left is a table that shows what those threshold levels are considered to be for chloride and boron. But as I was starting to say, even later in the study, even those boron levels were trending higher with increasing toxicity range, suggesting that there are likely native sources of boron in the soil that are impacting tree growth negatively. When they accounted or inventoried for the amount of salt that was added to the pistachio orchard root zone from planting in 2005 all the way to 2013, they found that there in the aqueduct treatment, 32,000 pounds of salt were applied per acre, with an overall increase in 2.6 decisiemens per meter in terms of the overall salt content of the soil. In comparison to the well water that was used, they had an estimate put on over 300,000 pounds of salt. Those trees saw, the soil that those trees were planted into saw an increase of 23.5 decisiemens per meter in the soil saturated extract. This is an aerial imagery just showing when it came to harvesting and collecting data. They took information from 40 trees from each of those different treatments that I mentioned, and conducted a harvest for three years. And for the sake of time, I'd just say that the yields declined 3% in those PG1 rootstocks and about 1.4% in UCB1 for every additional unit increase in EC above 5 to 6 decisiemens per meter after 10 years. So that's a really big take-home point, is that, you know, historically we've tended to think that pistachio might have much higher tolerance for saline soda conditions, but in a lot of these studies we're really seeing dramatic decreases with every increment increase in EC. So the trial example I just described emphasizes the importance of managing salinity levels to the extent that's possible. One way to do this with precision is to calculate reclamation leaching fractions based on the average salinity of soil throughout the root zone. And I am not going to give an example of how to calculate the leaching fraction here, but I will actually be discussing that in detail in another talk later in the short course. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so problems with water quality. So here's an example of what well water compared to aqueduct water may be in terms of differences in pH and bicarbonate levels. So in this example, we've got the well water with a pH of 8.4 and extremely high carbonates. And so keeping in mind that optimal range is between 6.5 and 7.5, and levels above this are associated with high levels of bicarbonates that can bind any calcium that is in the soil and greatly reduce soil infiltration, and then also induce micronutrient deficiencies. An acid injection in the range of about 200 to 500 pounds per acre of sulfuric acid might be sufficient to drive down the pH and neutralize those bicarbonates and release the calcium, which can displace sodium from the soil particles, so it can be leached from the soil profile. The Excel program that is referenced here, I will provide a link for in that later presentation. Okay, so if we've done those soil profiles that I mentioned with the pits, they came back, and yes, we have, you know, really high salt level problems throughout the root zone. We're going to need more. We're going to need to do more than just injecting acid through the irrigation system once we have everything installed. We want to try to reclaim things before planting. So we have an opportunity to incorporate something like sulfur to deeper depths than what's possible once the trees are in the ground. In the example here, we've got fine ball milled reclaimed sulfur applied at a 1.5 ton per acre rate, but banded in a 2-foot application where we're going to plant those trees. So that narrow 2-foot banding means that you're actually applying a 15 ton per acre rate. And hopefully that's going to be successful in helping you reduce your pH in the tree row. In order to get that sulfur down deeper in the root zone, we need to incorporate it with a furrowing shovel welded to a chisel shank. And we're going to drive that into a trench that was made with a slip plow. So here's some pictures here of that. And some pictures of the soil profile after those reclamation steps are taken, and showing that we get some of this, that fine milled sulfur down to a depth of 28 inches. And here's some analyses that were done by Blake, looking at what those soil conditions were prior to planting in this particular orchard. We had a pH around 7.6 with an SAR about 7, with those calcium levels at about 7.64. And then 1 year later, go back, sample that same area, see some reductions in the soil pH at the, in that top foot, decreased SAR. So the sulfur amendment was successful in forming calcium sulfate, which can displace, any possible sodium that's driving up that SAR conditions that could thereby be leached from the soil. So just here's just a little case and study of, what some of the potential benefits of taking those pre-planting reclamation efforts. And sorry, I went a little bit maybe out of order with this, but finally, more information about ground prep and deep tillage. How do we do this? So as I mentioned, we want to do those soil backhoe pits to understand those stratification layers on the land, and then we need to choose the right equipment to address those issues. So some different tools for soil modification. Both a slip plow or backhoe can be used to mix soil layers. Rippers are most useful for breaking up hard pan layers if you're encountering that within that active root zone where your pistachio trees will be growing. You can place your amendments and they can be mixed with the backhoe or sucked in by the slip plow, and that can be useful to help change the soil chemistry. As I said, that like you have this opportunity before planting, but it's going to be much more difficult to do. And there was that example of successfully lowering the soil pH by slip plowing and sulfur prior to planting. Here's another study conducted by Blake looking at pre-plant tillage on pistachio development under drip irrigation. They looked at augering only. So they did a row mark with a furrowing shovel. Sulfur was applied and incorporated with a second pass of the same shovel using a standard 3-point hitch auger. And then one slip plow passed on the tree row with a 15-inch shoe penetrating 42 to 50 inches into the soil. Another approach was to use that same slip plow treatment as I just mentioned, but then also using an additional pass of 6 feet on either side. And a fourth pass is going to be repeated down the center of that tree row to achieve a 52-inch penetration to further fracture that soil profile where there may be some constrictive layers. And then finally, they just looked at using a backhoe for each a 3-foot by 7-foot trench for planting. And here's some pictures of some of those modifications. And just suffice to say that, all of these different treatments, and in this particular study, they didn't see a lot of difference between using a backhoe versus the chisel or the slip 1 to 3 times. So without the control, I'm not sure how much, this improved conditions above doing nothing, but you have to assume that, there is much more benefit with doing these modifications than just augering the hole and planting the trees. So just in summary, what do we need to evaluate with pistachios? First of all, you need to understand, like I said, that life cycle. You need to have an idea of what those rooting characteristics are. What's the necessary spacing that you're going to need for good canopy structure, knowledge about the harvesting requirements. Make sure you know about the reliability of your water supply for the long term and understanding those potential costs, understanding what the chemistry is, what soil amendments or injections into the water are going to be necessary. We'll cover that more in the next talk. And then also, consider what that cost is going to be. Is land leveling necessary? What irrigation system is most suitable given what you know about the permeability of the soil? And and the type of water source that you have available. With that, I think that about finishes up what I have for this talk.
Okay.
And yeah, thank you.
You have about 10 minutes, May, and several questions here. So first, evidently the link for the soil types map is needs correction. They couldn't find the maps at that link,
Oh, okay.
just so you know that. Next question, what is your recommendation for soil profile backhoe versus soil auger? Which do
Okay.
you prefer?
Well, okay, so that backhoe is really going to give you a better picture of what you're going to run into in terms of with planting. The augering is nice. It's much easier to, I mean, it requires actually more physical labor, but you know, it's cheaper, quicker. Usually if you want to just do a quick analysis of that top 1 to 2 foot, that auger or a push probe. I'm sorry, I should have put a picture in of what those look like, but maybe I'll slip that in for the next talk. So the soil profile, using the backhoe is going to allow you a better picture, going to give you a better idea of what some of those modifications might be that are necessary. It's going to give you a more clear picture of where that those potential stratification lines are. So that's the nice thing about that web soil survey is that, you know, I mean, if you know from the survey, generally speaking, you've got a nice permeable sandy loam, maybe you can get away with just doing the augering pre-plant. But if you look at those surveys and you're like, oh, this soil type, this area is known for its stratified layers and constrictive clay layers and things like that, that's when you might want to come in and say, what are we dealing with here? Because, you know, those soil surveys, they're good, but they're really general to a broad region, and it's not telling you anything very specific about the soil of the site where you're going to be planting.
Okay. The next question is, what is the ECE toxicity threshold?
Okay, so I think that is a number that we're still working on, but I think that, as I mentioned in that one study, when we've looked at trees, or I shouldn't say we, but I should say you, Luis and Blake, we're but when looking at trees from planting, we generally tended to see a decrease in about 3% above 5 decisiemens per meter. So for every 1 unit increase in EC above 5, we're seeing a 3% decrease in yield over time. For the PG1, for the UCB1, it wasn't as bad. It was about a 1.4% decrease. And also, I would say that soils really, the texture and the chemistry can vary quite a bit in different areas. So if you have high levels of EC, but the soil is that it drains very well, you're probably going to have a higher threshold tolerance. I mean, maybe you can go up to 10 decisiemens per meter or something if the soil is draining well, if the roots have oxygen. If you have conditions that have, maybe you have a lot of silt in the soil, maybe there's been, just from repeated land use, there's been, disintegration of the soil quality at the surface. You're going to have a lower threshold for EC if the water doesn't drain from the system. That's really what we're fighting against, in my opinion. Here is drainage problems. Okay. With anoxia.
Thank you. Here's another one. It's kind of 2 parts. If SAR is high, above 5, and ECE is low, less than 0.05 decisiemens for soil, what does that mean and how to amend for that?
Okay, so yeah, sometimes like in the aqueduct example that I mentioned, we have very low EC levels, which is nice, because if we're trying to accomplish reclamation leaching either in season or out of season, we have more potential to decrease the soil EC level. But because of those low EC levels, sometimes in that cleaner water, that can cause problems with infiltration. So it's very important if we're reclaiming soil to make amendments, to make amendments to the soil to temporarily raise that EC of either the soil or of either the water or the soil that the water is coming in contact with, to help with that infiltration problem. So what it means is that we have there's a much higher level of sodium that's making up the composition of the salts relative to other nutrients, particularly calcium and magnesium. So we need to artificially raise that level of calcium to counter those high sodium levels.
And the second part, which may influence your answer then, was chlorides and boron are also low. ESP is high, 18. Saturation percentage, 37. Does that change your answer in any way?
Okay.
Sorry.
Is that you, Bob Beatty? No. Sorry. No.
Anonymous, it must be Beatty. No.
Okay. So I'm sorry. Say this again. The
Chlorides and boron are low.
Okay.
ESP high, 18. Saturation percentage, 37.
Okay. So we have relatively the saturation percentage of 37 tells us that this soil is relatively high in clay. I mean, it's kind of at that boundary between loam and clay. And if that's good that the boron and chloride levels are low, I'm going to have to ask more questions about where this average is coming from. Is if that average for the if that average for the SAR is for the top layer of the soil, we might take some different reclamation approaches than if it's through the entire root zone. If you have the ESP is 18 throughout the root zone, then we're going to use that information to make calculations about how much gypsum we need to apply, for example. But it's really going to be dependent on the depth of the root zone of the soil that we need to reclaim.
Yeah, that's why these questions are so hard. There's so many factors. The next question I think is probably going to come up in the Craig Callson's lecture. What's the ideal spacing for pistachios? I think you're going to hear that on Thursday from Craig. The next, do we need to break hard pan after planting? Does the hard pan form again after planting if you broke it before planting? And how significant is the issue of hard pan on root growth?
Yeah, so hard pan is at least in our area, hard pan is a common issue. And yes, I think that, maybe in reference to that last set of examples I was showing with different modification methods, is that the soil does have a tendency, depending on the size of that stratified layer. Maybe if it's a pretty shallow stratified layer, it may not have as much of a tendency to seal back together. If it's a thicker layer, chances are probably that that the benefits of that may be somewhat short-lived. But I think the goal is generally to get those tree roots established. I mean, you just have those first few years in the life of the tree to really establish good root structure. So yes, hard pan is going to tend to, in a lot of circumstances, come back together. In terms of what you can do about that, that's going to depend on how deep in the soil layer you're looking at. But in pistachio, we have this off the ground harvesting. I think it's things like cover crops in the alley, maybe something worth looking into. And then also other people are doing some deep shanking. We tend to think that doesn't actually hurt the trees, that it could actually be sort of rejuvenating, or maybe not rejuvenating, but it could be stimulating to tree roots to do some deep ripping. So those are some possible options actually once the orchard is established.
Okay. Here's one. How much on average does pre-plant sulfur application cost per acre?
I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah. And, okay, great. That'll be one you can answer in the, and maybe it differs with amount. Is there any data on cover crops and their effect on ECE, electrical conductivity?
I'm not aware of evidence that that covers tend to reduce pH in the immediate root zone. You know, and cover crops, you know, help with infiltration and the permeability of water. So it seems that there may be a better opportunity for salts to movement in the soil, so that there could be potential for a reduction in EC, or maybe even bioaccumulation by the cover crop could be another factor.
I think we have to end the questions. There are some that May can still answer, but it looks like it's time for the CCAs to scan their barcode and be signed in. Is that right,
Yeah.
Kelly? Or can she?
Yeah, Louise, I was going to say you can still keep proctoring questions to May. We are technically at the end of our designated agenda time, but if May doesn't mind answering a few more questions, I just wanted to get this slide up while she's answering, essentially reminding you that the next date of the course is this Thursday. We're going to start at 8 a.m. again. And then if we don't have any DPR private applicator credits today, the only thing that we have is certified crop advisor. And if you have the app on your phone, you can open it and scan the code that is going to be up for the next 5 minutes. If you don't have the app or don't have that ability, please email ANR program support with your CCA number and we can get you taken care of. I will drop that email address in the chat, as well as an evaluation. If this is your only day you're attending, definitely fill out the evaluation. If there's something in particular you want to comment on about today, you can fill out the evaluation today and then you can fill it out again on Thursday. It's not a problem. Each day you can fill it out. So I'll drop that link in as well. And yeah, Louise, I would say keep asking some questions. I'm just going to leave this up so people can take action and I'll post a few things in the chat.
Okay, May, the next question is, how critical is ripping to successfully establishing an orchard if there's no hard pan, soil is uniform to 8 feet, and it's a loam to clay loam?
Maybe not as critical. You know, I mean, in other circumstances where you have the stratified soil, we would probably definitely even recommend doing a cross ripping, but yeah, maybe not essential in those circumstances if you're lucky enough to have a deep uniform soil to 8 feet. I haven't seen too many circumstances with those nice conditions.
Getting worse. How deep should the moisture required in clay loam soil prior to the next irrigations? So how deeply should you irrigate a clay loam and let it dry before the next irrigation?
Yeah. So this can be tricky. Generally, we find that the best managed orchards aren't watering to those deeper depths. We're going to see a gradual decrease in soil moisture content through the season. So we're really irrigating to the top, probably 2 feet to replenish the soil moisture. And as far as what that percentage number is, we generally, you know, don't want to go much beyond 50% depletion of soil available water between irrigation sets, and you want to bring that moisture level back up to your established field capacity level. So for a clay loam, you know, maybe that would be 30% soil moisture, something like that.
Kelly, we're getting a couple questions about where is the app and how to scan it.
Oh, sorry.
I might want to repeat it again.
Oh, that app. Okay.
No, yeah. Oh, because
Okay.
somebody
So
did
for the
ask.
CCA app, you would go to your phone and to wherever, if you have an Apple phone or an Android, wherever you download applications and search for the CCA mobile app. And you should be able to do it that way. It also, I think you might not even have to have the app. I'm not sure if anybody that's a panelist that has done this, that does get CCA credits. I don't know if you just take a picture with your phone. I can see if it works myself, but you should go to your, let's see. Yeah, if you just take a picture, like if you go to your camera with your phone, it might be able to directly, but again, search for CCA in the App Store and you should be able to download it. And if you can't figure it out, don't even worry about it. Send me an email, ANR program support. I'll get you covered.
Great, thanks. Let's see, May, two-year-old leaves are exhibiting, I'm assuming these are cyan leaves. Second leaves exhibiting brown at the edge. What causes this? Is there any solution?
Okay, so there could be multiple things. So as I mentioned, oh, I'm sorry, say that again. So, I'm sorry, did you say that salt does not seem to be an issue?
He didn't specify. I think he's asking about the even brown rhyming at the edges of the leaf, but I'm assuming it's in a salty situation.
Right. Well,
maybe not even terribly salty, but
right. Yeah, because we can't see, sometimes in situations where there's been overwatering or the soils are saturated for too long, we will see similar necrotic conditions that can sometimes be confused for problems with salt. So if you're seeing it maybe that early in development at 2 years, you know, it might be earlier than we would expect to see specific ion toxicity from salinity, but at very high levels, you know, that may indeed be what you're seeing. But this could also be attributable to problems with over irrigation. If your young tree roots are compromised and they're not, you know, if they've been damaged from too much water, then they will have trouble taking up water and more nutrients and can become actually deficient, which could result in similar characteristics in the leaves.
here's one. What is decisiemens per meter?
Oh, okay. So decisiemens per meter is a measure of the ion concentration in the soil solution. So that is a number that you would get back from the lab that represents the conductivity of between ions in a saturated paste extract from the soil. And so actually sometimes the field levels of actual salinity could be much higher than what we get from that saturated paste extract from the soil lab.
Okay. Here's another one. If I had a soil with high pH, approximately 8.5, and high SAR value more than 9, which one should I address first while reclaim the soil? So high pH 8.5, high SAR over 9, which should I address first?
Okay, I'd also like to know, so I'm assuming that if you have a pH that's at 8.5, you probably also have high levels of lime or carbonates in the soil. And that those carbonates tend to bind any calcium that is in the soil. And so you could almost, if you use acid to neutralize that bicarbonate and reduce the soil pH, you can provide yourself with a free source of gypsum, calcium sulfate, because you can solubilize that calcium that's been locked up with the bicarbonates. That calcium can be used to displace sodium that's giving you a very high SAR level. So I guess I would first go after pH and bicarbonates, and then second address the SAR.
Okay. Here's another one. What is the EC tolerance limit for the UCB and PG1 rootstocks?
Well, so as I mentioned, I think PG1 is going to be much more sensitive to salt. And so I would say you really probably don't want to go much above that 4.5, 5 decisiemens per meter, or you can expect to have, up to a 3% decrease in yields annually with each increment in decisiemens per meter that you go above, say, 5 decisiemens per meter. UCB1, we think, may have a bit higher tolerance than that. So I don't know. I'd love to hear you chime in on this, Louise, but maybe UCB1, like going above 6, you're probably going to see declines that you don't like in your bottom line in terms of yield.
No, I think your answer is correct.
Okay.
And I think that's all the questions. I do have one correction. Phoebe wanted to let you know, oh, my phone, sorry. Phoebe wanted to let you know that she did have the alternate bearing index for the Lost Hills and Golden Hills exactly backwards. Instead of 0.2, I'm trying to look for the answer now. The 0.2 and 0.3 on the slide are backwards, just reverse them, and Phoebe will correct it on the slide presentation. It was a matter that it was incorrect in the reference she took it from. So that's our only correction for the day. And I think we'll see everybody on Thursday at 0800. Thank you very much.